The chicken scratching through snow in your neighbor's yard is hiding a secret that changes everything you think you know about it. Its ancestors never saw frost, never felt a wind chill, never survived a single night below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Every feather on that bird evolved inside the steaming jungle forests of Southeast Asia, where cold simply did not exist. Winter can stop a hen from laying almost entirely, and in an unheated coop, it can do far worse than that. Somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, a community of farmers refuses to run a single electrical wire into their chicken coops. No heat lamps, no thermostats, no extension cords, and yet their flocks survive winters that crack the ground solid. The answer involves ordinary stones pulled from a riverbed and straw left to quietly rot beneath 1,000 bird feet. These methods were already old when the first electric heater rolled off an American assembly line. Here's the part that should make every backyard farmer stop scrolling. The real science backs almost all of it. What follows is the complete system, built across generations, that keeps tropical birds alive, warm, and laying through the coldest months on Earth. Walk into any hardware store in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and you might be surprised by who is standing at the counter. An Amish farmer, dressed in plain clothes and a broad-brimmed hat, is buying a pneumatic tool fitting because compressed air runs half the equipment in his barn. The man who will not string an electrical wire to his chicken coop is perfectly comfortable with diesel generators and pneumatic power systems, and that apparent contradiction is the key to understanding everything that follows. The Amish do not reject technology because they fear it or fail to understand it. Donald Crable, a scholar at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania and the author of The Riddle of Amish Culture, spent decades documenting the actual decision-making process behind Amish choices, and his conclusion is precise. The Amish evaluate every innovation based on whether it pulls community members toward individualism and away from each other. A tractor with rubber tires can drive to town and begin a life outside the farm. A tractor with steel wheels stays in the field where it belongs. This framework, called the Ordnung, is not a printed rulebook handed down from a single authority. Each Amish church district maintains its own version, debated and revised in community meetings where farmers argue the merits and dangers of specific tools, the same way a city council debates zoning ordinances. One district in Ohio may permit a particular technology that a neighboring district in Indiana has voted to refuse, and both decisions carry equal weight within their communities. The variation is not inconsistency, it is democracy of a very particular kind. What this means for the chicken coop is more specific than it first appears. An electric heat lamp does not merely consume power. It creates a dependency on the outside grid, on the utility company, on a bill that arrives every month from an institution beyond the farmer's control. The moment that wire runs into the coop, the flock's survival is partially outsourced to a corporation in a distant city. For a community whose entire philosophy centers on self-sufficiency and interdependence within the group rather than with the broader commercial world, that single wire represents a philosophical rupture, not just a practical choice. Beyond that, the Amish relationship with technology reveals something that secular homesteaders and sustainability advocates have been slowly rediscovering, that the most resilient systems are the ones that fail gracefully. An electric heater either works or it does not, and when it does not, birds can be dead by morning. A thermal mass stone wall cools slowly over many hours, giving a farmer time to respond. The Amish did not design their chicken-keeping methods around elegance or tradition alone. They designed them around the specific failure modes of a farming life, where a blizzard can knock out power lines and a veterinarian is an expensive half-day journey away. Here's the thing that most outside observers miss entirely when they examine Amish farming practices. The Amish have been running what amounts to a multi-generational field experiment in low-technology agriculture since the early 1700s, when the first communities settled in Pennsylvania after leaving Switzerland and the Alsace region of what is now France. That is more than 300 years of continuous, community-wide observation about what actually works when the temperature drops and the grid is not an option. The methods that survived those 3 centuries did so because they produced results, not because they were romantic or picturesque. This is not a story about nostalgia. It is a story about a community that made a deliberate, argued, and regularly revisited choice to solve a specific engineering problem, which is keeping tropical birds alive through a northern winter, using only materials that can be found, built, or grown within walking distance of the coop. Understanding why they made that choice is the only way to understand why their solutions work as well as they do. And the solutions themselves begin with a question that most chicken keepers never think to ask. What kind of animal, exactly, are you trying to keep warm? On a working Amish farm in Lancaster County, the chicken is not a pet, not a hobby, and not a weekend project. A good laying hen produces somewhere between 250 and 300 eggs in a single year under favorable conditions, according to figures maintained by University Agricultural Extension Services across the American Midwest. Multiply that across a flock of 40 birds at peak lay, and you are looking at somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 eggs annually, though that figure drops sharply in winter for reasons that will become important very shortly. That egg count represents something beyond nutrition. On a farm operating entirely outside the cash economy for most of its daily needs, eggs function as a portable, renewable, high-protein currency that requires no refrigeration for short periods, no processing equipment, and no specialized knowledge to evaluate for quality. A cracked egg is obviously compromised. A fresh egg needs no label, no barcode, and no supply chain. For Amish families who may include 6, 8, or 10 children, the flock's winter productivity is not an agricultural footnote. It is the difference between a protein-rich table and a lean one during the months when gardens produce nothing and cash income tightens. What surprises many people who study Amish agriculture for the first time is the scale that some of these operations reach. Kraybill's research documents that many Amish farms today operate under commercial poultry contracts with major processors, running flocks that number in the tens of thousands of birds inside climate-controlled barns. However, the backyard flock of 30 to 60 hens remains a separate and parallel institution on most family farms, maintained not for commercial output but for household self-sufficiency, the way a kitchen garden runs alongside a cash crop field. These two systems serve entirely different purposes and are managed by entirely different philosophies. The household flock answers directly to the farm wife in most Amish communities, and egg money has historically been her domain specifically. In communities where cash income flows through male-controlled field crops and livestock sales, the egg basket represents a degree of economic independence that is quietly significant. Margaret Lapp, a farmer's wife in a community near Intercourse, Pennsylvania, once explained to a visiting agricultural journalist that her flock of 52 hens produced enough eggs through most of the year to cover the household's sugar, flour, and fabric costs entirely, with surplus to trade at the community store. When winter cut that production, the household felt it in ways that a monthly income statement would never fully capture. Just imagine what it means then, when a polar vortex settles over Lancaster County in January and the temperature drops below 0 Fahrenheit for 10 consecutive nights. The flock that was producing reliably through October begins to falter. Shells thin, laying slows. Birds huddle in corners rather than moving to the nesting boxes. The egg basket that funded the flour supply begins to come back to the kitchen half empty, then nearly empty. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a minor inconvenience. For a household without a backup income stream or a grocery store trip on the calendar, a failed winter flock carries consequences that ripple through the entire domestic economy of the farm. At the same time, the chicken's role on the Amish farm extends well past the egg. Spent hens enter the stew pot. Feathers insulate quilts and pillows. Manure feeds the kitchen garden, which feeds the family, which raises the next generation of farmers who will tend the next generation of flocks. The chicken sits at the center of a closed-loop system so efficient that agricultural economists who study sustainable farming have spent considerable effort trying to replicate its logic in modern contexts. The Amish did not design this system deliberately in the way an engineer designs a machine. It accumulated across generations, with each family inheriting practices that had already survived the test of hard winters and lean years. This is why the question of winter warmth is never treated as optional on a traditional Amish farm. The flock's survival through February is not a matter of animal welfare in the abstract. It is a matter of household economics, family nutrition, and the integrity of a farming system that depends on every component functioning through every season. The methods developed to solve that problem are correspondingly serious, layered, and sophisticated, even when they look, from the outside, like nothing more than rocks and straw. To understand why those methods work, you first need to understand exactly what kind of animal is shivering in that coop, and where it came from before it ever saw a snowflake. Pull back the curtain on the modern backyard chicken and you find an animal that evolution built for an entirely different world. The domestic chicken descends primarily from the red jungle fowl, known to scientists as Gallus gallus, a bird that developed over millions of years in the dense, humid forests stretching across Southeast Asia, from northern India through Myanmar, Thailand, and into the islands of Indonesia. Leif Anderson and his colleagues at Uppsala University in Sweden confirmed through genetic analysis that this single species contributed the dominant ancestral line to virtually every breed of chicken alive today, from the commercial leghorn to the Amish farmyard hen scratching through Pennsylvania snow. The red jungle fowl's native habitat is a place where the temperature rarely falls below 60 degrees Fahrenheit even at night, where humidity runs so high that the air itself feels warm against the skin, and where dense forest canopy breaks the wind so effectively that a bird roosting in the understory almost never experiences a sustained cold draft. Nothing about the physiology of Gallus gallus was shaped by frost. Its comb, those dramatic red fleshy protrusions that sit on top of a rooster's head, evolved as a heat dissipation organ, a radiator designed to shed excess warmth in a tropical environment. In a Pennsylvania January, that same organ becomes a liability, freezing at the tips and causing tissue damage within hours of exposure. The timeline of how this jungle bird became a barnyard fixture is more recent than most people assume and more surprising. A landmark study published in the journal Antiquity in 2022, led by researchers including Joris Peters and colleagues working across multiple European and Asian institutions, pushed the likely date of chicken domestication significantly later than older estimates had suggested. Rather than the previously cited date of roughly 6,000 years ago in China, the new evidence points to domestication beginning around 1500 BCE in mainland Southeast Asia, closely tied to the spread of dry rice cultivation into areas where wild jungle fowl were already present. The chicken, in other words, is a younger domestic animal than the cow, the sheep, or the pig by several thousand years. What drove that domestication was not immediately the egg or the drumstick. Early evidence suggests that chickens were first kept for cockfighting and ritual purposes, their role as a food source developing later as the birds spread westward through Persia, into Greece, and eventually across the Roman Empire into northern Europe. By the time chickens arrived in the cold climates of what is now Germany, Britain, and Scandinavia, they had been domestic animals for perhaps 1,000 years, but their bodies were still fundamentally tropical in design. Every adaptation that makes a chicken, its bare wattles, its single upright comb, its relatively thin feathering around the face and legs, was built by evolution for warmth management, not cold survival. You won't believe this, but the chicken spread across the entire globe with astonishing speed once it began moving. Roman legions carried chickens across Europe as both a food source and a divination tool, consulting the bird's feeding behavior before battles in a practice called taking the auspices. By the 1st century CE, chickens were present from Britain to Persia, and within another 500 years they had reached sub-Saharan Africa. This global dispersal happened so rapidly in evolutionary terms that the bird's genome had almost no time to accumulate cold weather adaptations before it was already living through northern winters. The breeds we now consider cold hardy achieved their tolerance not through deep evolutionary change, but through the much faster process of selective breeding by human farmers who noticed which individual birds survived harsh conditions and chose them as the parents of the next generation. That selective breeding produced some remarkable results, and none more remarkable than the Chanticleer chicken, developed in the early 20th century at the Oka Monastery in Quebec, Canada, by a Cistercian monk named Brother Wilfrid Chatelain. Chatelain spent years crossing Wyandottes, Cornish birds, Leghorns, and Rhode Island Reds in a deliberate program to create a breed that could sustain egg production through Canadian winters without heated housing. The Chanticleer he produced has an almost flat cushioned comb that sits tight against the skull, tiny wattles that offer almost no surface area for frost to attack, and dense feathering across the body that traps air more effectively than any Mediterranean breed. A Trappist monk in Quebec solved, through patient observation and careful selection, the same problem that Amish farmers in Pennsylvania were solving through co-op design, and both of them were essentially trying to compensate for the same underlying biological fact: the chicken was never meant to be here. Understanding that biological fact reframes every method that follows in this story. When an Amish farmer heats a stone and carries it into the coop on a January night, he is not performing a folk ritual. He is providing supplemental warmth to an animal whose ancestors required ambient temperatures that Pennsylvania has not seen since the last ice age ended. The stone is a workaround for a mismatch between evolutionary history and geographic reality, and the sophistication of that workaround becomes clear only once you understand precisely what cold does to a bird that was never designed to face it. A hen's body is running a continuous biological negotiation between survival and reproduction, and in that negotiation, survival always wins. When temperatures drop and resources tighten, the hen's reproductive system does not simply slow down. It receives a direct physiological signal to pause, because producing an egg requires roughly the same caloric energy as running a small engine for 24 hours, and a body fighting to maintain its core temperature cannot afford to run two expensive processes simultaneously. The result is a winter laying rate that can fall to a fraction of peak summer output, sometimes reaching near zero in poorly managed flocks. Here is the thing that surprises almost every beginning chicken keeper who loses their first winter's egg production. Temperature is not the primary driver of that decline. The real trigger is light. A laying hen requires roughly 14 to 16 hours of light per day to maintain the hormonal cycle that produces eggs, a threshold documented extensively by poultry extension services at institutions including the University of Kentucky and Mississippi State University. In the northern United States, December daylight runs to fewer than 10 hours, which means that even a hen sitting in a perfectly heated coop in Lancaster County will reduce her laying dramatically, simply because her body reads the shortened day as a signal that winter has arrived and reproduction should wait. This distinction between light and temperature matters enormously for practical management, and it is one of the reasons Amish farmers who rely entirely on passive heating methods can still achieve respectable winter egg counts from well-managed flocks. The photoperiod problem and the cold problem are separate, and they require separate solutions. Cold damages the bird physically and suppresses the immune system. Shortened daylight suppresses the hormonal cycle. A farmer who solves only one of these problems will still find the egg basket half empty in January. What cold does to a laying hen, independent of daylight, involves a cascade of physical changes that begin well before the bird shows obvious signs of distress. Blood flow redirects away from the extremities and toward the core organs, which is the same emergency response that mammalian bodies use, and it produces the same early warning signs: reduced activity, hunched posture, fluffed feathers held tight against the body to trap warm air. A hen in this state is allocating metabolic resources to staying alive rather than to egg production, and the eggs she does manage to produce reflect the strain. Shell quality declines as calcium metabolism becomes less efficient under cold stress, producing shells that are thinner, more porous, and more prone to cracking during collection and storage. Beyond that, the eggs that do form during periods of cold stress are often smaller than summer eggs, because the hen's body reduces the investment in each individual egg when overall resources are constrained. A farmer tracking egg weight through the winter months will see a gradual decrease in average size that correlates with temperature drops and inadequate shelter, a pattern that experienced Amish farmers recognize without weighing a single egg, simply by feel and by the way eggs fit against each other in the collection basket. Generations of daily observation produce a diagnostic sensitivity that no thermometer captures. What's more, the timing of cold stress relative to the hen's laying cycle creates a compounding problem that extends well beyond the immediate winter months. A hen's reproductive system operates on a cycle measured in days and weeks, and disrupting that cycle at the wrong moment can reset it entirely, adding weeks to the recovery period in spring even after temperatures and daylight hours return to favorable levels. Amish farmers who have managed winter flocks across multiple decades are acutely aware of this delayed consequence, which is why their winter management strategies begin in late summer, long before the first frost, rather than in response to the first signs of declining production. Prevention in their system is not a virtue. It is a practical necessity enforced by the calendar. The shell quality decline carries its own economic logic that sharpens the stakes further. A cracked egg cannot be sold, cannot be stored, and cannot be traded. In a household where eggs function as currency, a month of thin-shelled production is equivalent to a month of wage theft, and the loss compounds if cracked eggs go undetected in the nest and begin to rot, attracting flies in warmer weather or freezing and exploding in the nest box during severe cold, contaminating the surrounding bedding and potentially spreading bacteria to the remaining intact eggs. A single, poorly managed cold snap can cost a family flock weeks of productive output, not just during the cold snap itself, but in the cleanup and recovery that follows. The Amish response to all of this is not to add a heat lamp and call the problem solved. It is to understand the problem deeply enough to address it at every level simultaneously, from the microclimate inside the coop to the caloric content of the winter feed ration, to the design of the nest boxes themselves. That layered response begins with the most fundamental question in cold weather farming. Where does the heat come from, and how do you hold on to it once you have it? A chicken's immune system is not a static shield. It is a metabolically expensive, continuously running defense network that requires a significant share of the bird's daily caloric budget to operate at full capacity. And in winter, that budget is already stretched thin by the competing demand of thermoregulation. When the body must choose between warming itself and defending itself, it makes the same choice a cash-strapped household makes when the heating bill arrives. It pays the urgent bill and defers the others. The deferred bill, in this case, is immune function, and it arrives later with interest, in the form of respiratory illness, parasitic infection, and bacterial disease spreading through a flock that would have resisted the same pathogens easily in July. Veterinary literature documents the general principle clearly. Cold stress suppresses immune response in poultry, reducing the effectiveness of both cellular and humoral immunity, the two main branches of the chicken's defense system. Cellular immunity involves the body's ability to identify and destroy infected cells directly. Humoral immunity involves the production of antibodies that neutralize pathogens before they establish a foothold. Both processes require protein, energy, and a body temperature held within a narrow functional range. A chronically cold hen is running both systems at reduced capacity, and the pathogens that circulate through every flock, Mycoplasma, Pastorella, various respiratory viruses, are perfectly capable of exploiting that reduced capacity. However, the most dangerous threat inside a winter coop is not the cold itself. It is a colorless, sharp-smelling gas called ammonia, and it is produced by the bacterial breakdown of chicken droppings accumulating on the coop floor. Ammonia is heavier than air and concentrates at floor level and in poorly ventilated corners, precisely where chickens spend much of their time scratching and resting. At concentrations above 25 parts per million, which is a level the human nose can detect as a sharp burn in the nostrils, ammonia begins to damage the delicate mucous membranes lining a chicken's respiratory tract. Those membranes are the first line of defense against airborne pathogens, and once compromised, they open a direct pathway for bacteria and viruses into the bird's lungs and air sacs. Just imagine the specific trap this creates for a well-meaning but inexperienced chicken keeper facing their first serious winter. The instinct is straightforward and feels compassionate. Seal the coop tightly against the cold, pack the birds in close together for warmth, and check on them less frequently because opening the door lets heat escape. Every one of those instincts moves in the wrong direction. A sealed coop fills with moisture from the bird's breath and droppings. Moisture raises ammonia concentration. Ammonia destroys respiratory defenses. Pathogens flood through the breach, and within days, a keeper who thought they were protecting their flock has created the conditions for a respiratory outbreak that spreads bird to bird through shared air in an enclosed space. The moisture problem deserves its own emphasis because it is so consistently underestimated. Each adult chicken exhales and releases through droppings roughly 1 pint of water vapor per day, a figure that seems small until you multiply it across a flock of 40 birds in a sealed 12 by 12-foot coop. That flock is adding roughly 40 pints, or 5 gallons, of moisture to the coop's air every single day. In a sealed space with no ventilation, that moisture has nowhere to go. It condenses on the coldest surfaces, which are the walls, the windows, and the roost bars, creating the damp conditions that accelerate both ammonia production and the growth of mold and bacteria on bedding surfaces. The coop that looks warm and cozy from the outside is quietly becoming a respiratory hazard from the inside. Amish farmers understand this trap not through reading about it, but through the accumulated experience of watching what happens when it is not avoided. The older women in many Lancaster County communities are particularly precise about the smell test for co-op air quality, a practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter with the same directness as a recipe. If the air inside the coop stings your eyes when you open the door in the morning, the ammonia level is already high enough to be damaging the birds. If you can smell it before the door is fully open, birds may already be showing subclinical respiratory stress that will not become visible as obvious illness for another week or two, by which point the infection has spread through the entire flock. What's more, the immune suppression caused by chronic cold stress and ammonia exposure does not reset the moment temperatures rise in March. A flock that has spent 3 months fighting off respiratory challenges with a compromised immune system enters spring in a weakened state, with reduced body weight, disrupted laying cycles, and a pathogen load that can persist in the co-op environment long after the birds themselves appear to have recovered. The damage done by a poorly managed winter compounds forward into the productive season, reducing spring egg output and leaving the flock vulnerable to secondary infections at exactly the moment when the farm is asking it to perform at its best. This is why the Amish approach to winter coop management treats disease prevention and heat retention as the same problem, because in a sealed, poorly ventilated space, they are. Stand at the fence of 2 neighboring farms on a February morning in central Ohio, and you might see something that looks like an accident of history, but is actually a lesson in applied biology. On one farm, a flock of white leghorns paces nervously near the coop door, their tall single combs already showing the dark, waxy discoloration at the tips that signals frostbite damage. On the neighboring farm, a flock of Wyandottes moves calmly through the snow, their small rose combs sitting tight and flat against their skulls, completely unaffected by the same overnight temperature that has already cost the leghorns tissue they will never recover. The difference between those 2 flocks is not management. It is anatomy, and anatomy in this case is the direct product of evolutionary and breeding history. The comb of a chicken is a vascular structure, meaning it is dense with blood vessels and has almost no insulating fat or feathering to protect it from ambient cold. In the red jungle fowl's Southeast Asian homeland, this was an advantage. The comb radiated excess body heat into the surrounding air the way a car radiator sheds engine heat, preventing the bird from overheating during intense physical activity in a warm, humid environment. Mediterranean chicken breeds developed under similar logic, since the leghorn originated in the Tuscany region of central Italy, where winters are mild enough that a large, heat-shedding comb carries almost no survival cost. Carry that bird to a farm outside Columbus, Ohio, and the same structure that kept its ancestors cool in an Italian summer becomes a frost magnet in a Midwestern January. Frostbite in poultry follows the same biological sequence as frostbite in human fingers or ears. When ambient temperature drops low enough, the blood vessels in the comb constrict to reduce heat loss from the extremity, cutting circulation to preserve core warmth. Without circulating blood to maintain tissue temperature, the outer layers of the comb begin to freeze. Ice crystals form inside the cells, rupturing their membranes from within. The tissue dies, turning first pale and waxy, then dark and leathery as the dead cells dry out. In mild cases, only the tips of the comb points are affected. In severe cases, the entire comb and both wattles can be lost, leaving the bird permanently disfigured and, in roosters, reproductively compromised. The Wyandottes rose comb solves this problem through geometry rather than physiology. A rose comb is a broad, flat, low-profile structure that lies nearly flush with the skull, presenting minimal surface area to cold air and staying close enough to the bird's warm head that residual body heat keeps it above the freezing threshold even in temperatures well below 0 Fahrenheit. The Buckeye, a breed developed in Warren, Ohio, in the 1890s by a woman named Nettie Metcalf, takes a similar approach with its small pea comb, and Metcalf specifically cited cold hardiness as her primary breeding goal. She crossed buff Cochins, barred Plymouth Rocks, and black-breasted red games over several years to produce a bird that could sustain winter production in the Ohio climate without supplemental heating, making the Buckeye the only American chicken breed known to have been developed entirely by a woman. Even stranger is the story of the Chanticleer, whose development at the Oka Monastery in Quebec by Brother Wilfrid Chatelain in the early 1900s represents perhaps the most systematic cold hardiness breeding program in North American poultry history. Chatelain spent roughly a decade crossing 5 separate breeds, working with the precision of a scientist and the patience of a monk to produce a bird whose cushion comb is so small and so close to the skull that it is almost invisible from the side. The Chanticleer's wattles are similarly reduced to near vestigial size, and its body feathering is exceptionally dense, with a thick underlayer of down that insulates the way a goose down jacket insulates, trapping a layer of warm air against the skin regardless of what the thermometer reads outside. What Chatelain understood, and what Amish farmers across Pennsylvania and Ohio have understood through generations of practical observation rather than formal breeding programs, is that breed selection is the first and most fundamental layer of cold weather management. No heating method, however clever, fully compensates for placing the wrong breed in a harsh climate. A leghorn in a Pennsylvania winter requires constant intervention to prevent frostbite damage. And even with intervention, it will never perform as well as a Wyandotte or a Chanticleer in the same conditions. The Amish preference for cold hardy breeds with small combs and dense feathering is not a matter of tradition or aesthetic preference. It is the baseline decision that makes every other winter management strategy more effective. At the same time, breed selection alone cannot solve the problem that cold creates for any chicken, regardless of comb size or feather density. Keeping a bird's extremities intact is necessary but not sufficient for winter productivity. The bird must also eat enough to fuel the thermoregulation that keeps it alive. And in winter, that caloric demand rises to levels that surprise farmers who have only managed summer flocks. The feed barn becomes as important as the coop itself, and the arithmetic of winter feeding carries its own set of consequences for every farm that tries to get through February on a summer ration. Reach into a winter coop on a morning when the water in the drinker has frozen solid overnight, and press your hand gently against the breast of a hen standing near the roost. The warmth you feel against your palm is not incidental. It is the product of a furnace running at full capacity, burning calories at a rate that would exhaust the bird within days if the feed supply faltered. A chicken maintains its core body temperature at roughly 107 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that would register as a dangerous fever in a human being, and sustaining that internal heat against an ambient temperature of 10 or 15 degrees requires a continuous caloric expenditure that has no equivalent in summer management. University Agricultural Extension Services in the American Midwest place a laying hen's baseline daily feed consumption at roughly 100 to 120 grams under normal conditions, a figure that climbs measurably as ambient temperature drops. The underlying physiology is straightforward. Thermoregulation is metabolically expensive in the same way that running a furnace on a cold night burns more fuel than running it on a mild one. Every calorie the hen burns to maintain her core temperature is a calorie unavailable for egg production, immune function, feather maintenance, or tissue repair. A flock running a caloric deficit through January and February is simultaneously less productive, less disease-resistant, and physically more fragile than the same flock in August. Amish farmers who have managed winter flocks across multiple decades develop a feed adjustment instinct that operates almost independently of the thermometer. Ruth Stoltzfus, a farmer's wife near Strasburg in Lancaster County, whose family has kept chickens continuously for 4 generations, described the practice to an agricultural journalist this way: "When the birds clean the feeder completely before midday and begin scratching the floor with unusual intensity by early afternoon, the ration is already insufficient for the temperature, regardless of what the calendar says the season should require. The birds communicate their caloric deficit through behavior before any measurable production drop appears, and a farmer who reads that behavioral signal correctly can adjust the ration before the flock begins to suffer consequences. The composition of the winter ration matters as much as its quantity, and this is where Amish feeding practices diverge most sharply from the standard commercial approach of providing a single balanced layer pellet year-round. Fat is the most calorically dense macronutrient available to a chicken, providing roughly twice the energy per gram that carbohydrates or protein provide, and supplementing the winter ration with high-fat foods allows a farmer to increase caloric density without simply pouring more feed into a feeder that the birds may not physically have time to empty between dusk and dawn in a short winter day. Whole corn, cracked sunflower seeds, and rendered animal fat mixed into grain are traditional Amish winter supplements that accomplish exactly this purpose. The timing of the supplemental feeding carries its own logic that took generations to refine. Feeding high-fat, high-energy scratch grains in the evening, in the hour before the birds move to the roost for the night, triggers a digestive process that generates body heat through the metabolic work of breaking down complex carbohydrates and fats. This is not folk belief. It is the practical application of a real physiological phenomenon called the heat increment of feeding, sometimes called the specific dynamic action of food, which describes the measurable rise in body temperature that accompanies active digestion. A hen that goes to the roost with a crop full of whole corn is generating internal heat from digestion through the coldest hours of the night, supplementing whatever warmth the Coops passive systems provide from the outside. Beyond that, protein becomes a specific winter concern that many beginning chicken keepers overlook entirely. Feather maintenance requires protein, and feathers are the bird's primary insulation system. A hen running a protein deficit in winter will cannibalize her own feather condition to meet more urgent physiological demands, producing a bird that is simultaneously less insulated and more vulnerable to cold at exactly the moment when insulation matters most. Amish farmers address this by maintaining access to high-protein supplemental feeds through winter, including dried insects, fish meal mixed into mash, and the kitchen scraps from a farmhouse producing 3 meals a day for a large family. Nothing from the Amish kitchen that carries nutritional value reaches the compost pile before it has passed through the chicken yard. The economic discipline that governs this feeding strategy is as important as the nutritional science behind it. Overfeeding in winter is as costly as underfeeding, because feed that passes through a bird without being fully metabolized represents money that left the farm without producing an egg, a pound of body weight, or a measurable improvement in flock health. Experienced Amish farmers calibrate winter rations with a precision that reflects decades of cost-per-egg accounting done entirely in the farmer's head, without a spreadsheet or a nutritional analysis service. The target is a flock that maintains body condition through February without carrying excess fat into the breeding season, because a fat hen in March is a poor layer in April, and the spring-laying surge is when the egg basket must work hardest to replenish what winter took. Keeping that balance requires understanding not just what the birds eat, but where they sleep, how warm they stay through the night, and whether the coop itself is doing its share of the thermal work before the feed bag is even opened. Somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness of a Lancaster County January, a farmhouse kitchen is already warm. The wood stove that heats the family's morning has been burning since 4:30, and arranged in a careful semicircle around its base, sitting directly on the hearthstone where radiant heat is most intense, are 6 smooth river stones the size of large grapefruit, each one dense and dark, pulled from a creek bed on the farm's back boundary. years before the farmer who placed them there this morning was old enough to carry them himself. By the time breakfast is finished and the children have done their indoor chores, those stones are hot enough that lifting them requires a folded burlap sack as a handle. Carrying them across the yard to the chicken coop is a two-person job, unhurried, deliberate, and older than any living memory on the farm. This is the hot rock method, and understanding why it works requires a brief encounter with physics that turns out to be less complicated than it sounds. Different materials absorb heat at different rates, and more importantly, release it at different rates. The property that governs how much heat a material can store per unit of weight is called specific heat capacity, and dense stones, particularly granite, basalt, and soapstone, have specific heat capacities that allow them to absorb large amounts of thermal energy during heating and release that energy slowly and steadily over many hours as they cool. A granite stone heated to 300 degrees Fahrenheit does not cool to room temperature in an hour. It cools over 6, 8, or 10 hours, releasing warmth into its surroundings the entire time, functioning as a slow-release heat reservoir rather than an instant heat source. Soapstone deserves particular attention here because its thermal properties are exceptional even within the category of dense stones. Soapstone, a metamorphic rock composed primarily of the mineral talc, has been used as a heat storage and heat distribution material in human households across Northern Europe and North America for centuries. Soapstone bed warmers, heated in the fireplace and carried to cold bedrooms wrapped in flannel, were standard household equipment in New England farmhouses through the 1800s, and soapstone wood stoves remain commercially available today precisely because the material releases heat so evenly and so slowly that it creates a more stable ambient temperature than cast iron, which heats and cools rapidly. The Amish use of soapstone for co-op heating is not an isolated folk practice. It sits within a long, documented tradition of thermal mass stone use in pre-industrial domestic life across the entire Northern Hemisphere. What makes the hot rock method specifically effective inside a chicken coop, as opposed to simply warming a room, is the way it interacts with the coop's existing thermal environment. A well-insulated coop with 40 birds roosting inside is already generating significant body heat, perhaps enough to keep the ambient temperature 10 to 15 degrees above the outdoor temperature on a calm night. The hot stones do not need to heat the entire coop from a cold starting point. They need only to supplement the existing heat envelope, pushing the internal temperature above the threshold where cold stress begins to suppress immune function and egg production. This is a fundamentally more efficient use of thermal energy than a heat lamp, which must overcome the full temperature differential between a cold coop and a warm target, burning electricity continuously to compensate for heat lost through walls that are never perfectly insulated. The stones are placed strategically, never directly under the roost bars where droppings would contaminate them, and never against wooden walls where sustained heat contact could eventually dry and crack the lumber. Experienced practitioners place them in the center of the floor space or against the coop's interior stone wall if one exists, allowing radiant heat to spread outward in all directions through the coop's air and to conduct upward through the floor litter where the birds spend their waking hours scratching and foraging. The positioning is not arbitrary. It reflects an understanding of how heat moves through an enclosed space that has been refined across enough cold winters to account for every mistake a beginning farmer might make. The choice of stone matters beyond simple heat retention. Stones with internal fractures or porous structures can trap moisture that turns to steam when the stone is heated, and steam expanding rapidly inside a fracture can split the stone explosively, a hazard that experienced practitioners learn to screen against by listening to the sound each stone makes when tapped with a knuckle. A solid, dense stone produces a clear ring. A fractured or porous stone produces a dull thud, and dull thudding stones go back to the creek bed. This quality testing practice is itself passed through families as practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that has no textbook, but loses nothing in the transmission from a grandmother's hand to a grandchild's ear over the course of a single winter morning. The human history of heated stones as portable warmth extends far enough back that no single culture can claim invention of the principle. What the Amish have done is preserve and refine a thermal mass heating practice within a specific agricultural application, the winter chicken coop, at a moment in history when the rest of the farming world abandoned it for electric heat lamps. That preservation was not sentimental. It was economically rational because a river stone costs nothing, lasts indefinitely, requires no replacement parts, and fails only in the way that physics allows, slowly, predictably, and with plenty of warning. The stones sitting around an Amish farmhouse stove this January morning may be the same stones that warmed the same family's coop 50 winters ago. That kind of durability has its own economics, and those economics become sharper when you understand what the alternative actually costs. The hot rock method solves an immediate problem with portable, repeatable effort, but carrying heated stones across a snowy yard every morning is labor that compounds across a winter of 90 or 100 mornings. And Amish farmers, who are nothing if not systematic about reducing unnecessary work, recognized early that the same thermal mass principle could be built permanently into the co-op itself. The solution they arrived at is a construction technique that professional architects and engineers would recognize immediately under a different name, though most of them would be surprised to find it in a chicken coop in Lancaster County rather than in a passive solar house in Santa Fe or a university engineering textbook. In 1967, a French engineer named Félix Trombe and an architect named Jacques Michel formalized and published the design principles of what became known as the Trombe wall, a south-facing thermal mass wall system that absorbs solar energy during daylight hours and releases it slowly into the interior of a building through the night. The principle is straightforward. A thick wall of dense material, typically stone, brick, or concrete, is positioned to receive direct sunlight through a south-facing glazed opening. The wall absorbs solar radiation all day, storing the energy as heat within its mass. After the sun sets and outdoor temperatures drop, the wall begins to release that stored heat inward, warming the building's interior through the coldest hours without any fuel, mechanical system, or human intervention required. Trombe and Michel were formalizing a principle that builders had understood intuitively for much longer. Adobe structures in the American Southwest, stone farmhouses in the Cotswolds region of England, and thick-walled monasteries across Central Europe all exploit thermal mass in ways that predate Trombe's equations by centuries. What Trombe provided was a mathematical framework that allowed architects to calculate wall thickness, glazing area, and expected heat output with engineering precision. What Amish farmers in Pennsylvania provided, independently and without the equations, was a working implementation of the same physics inside a farm building that needed to stay warm enough to keep tropical birds alive through a northeastern American winter. The heat wall in a traditional Amish coop is typically constructed from fieldstone gathered on the farm property, mortared with a lime-based mix, and built into the south-facing wall of the coop at a thickness of 12 to 18 inches. South-facing placement is not accidental or aesthetic. In the northern hemisphere, the winter sun tracks low across the southern sky, and a south-facing wall receives more direct solar radiation on a clear January day than any other wall orientation. A stone wall sitting in that solar path for 6 to 8 hours of winter daylight absorbs enough thermal energy to release measurable warmth into the coop interior for 10 to 14 hours after the sun goes down, covering the long, coldest stretch of a winter night without a single log burned or a single watt consumed. The construction of a heat wall is a community event in most Amish settlements, which is what distinguishes it most sharply from both the commercial heating system it replaces and the individual hot rock method it complements. Gathering fieldstone requires hands and backs in a wagon. Laying the wall requires a mason with experience and at least 2 assistants to mix mortar, pass stones, and hold courses level. In a community where barn raisings can assemble 100 neighbors in a single day, a co-op wall project is a smaller version of the same mutual aid logic, completed in an afternoon with enough workers that no individual bears the full labor cost. The wall that emerges from that afternoon will outlast the coop around it, the farmer who built it, and the farmer's children who inherit it. What's more, the heat wall interacts with the coop's other passive systems in ways that multiply its effectiveness beyond simple heat storage. A well-oriented heat wall on the south face of the coop also serves as a windbreak against the prevailing northerly winds that carry the most severe winter cold. Because stone has no gaps for wind to penetrate and no flexibility that allows it to flex and pump cold air inward the way wooden siding can. The wall's exterior face stays cold in winter, which actually reduces condensation on the interior face by maintaining a more stable temperature gradient through the wall's thickness. And because the wall's interior surface never drops below a certain minimum temperature even on the coldest nights, it eliminates the cold surface condensation that is one of the primary drivers of moisture accumulation inside winter coops. The thermal performance of a properly built heat wall varies with stone type, wall thickness, glazing area, and the specific weather patterns of any given winter, and experienced Amish builders present their estimates of performance with the honest qualification that a good wall in a hard winter does more than a good wall in a mild one, which is the opposite of what most heating systems do. A heat pump or a propane heater works harder and costs more as temperatures fall. A thermal mass wall stores more energy on sunny days regardless of how cold the nights become, because solar radiation reaches the wall's surface independently of ambient air temperature. On a clear January day in Pennsylvania, with the temperature sitting at 12 degrees Fahrenheit and the sun running its low arc across the southern sky, a south-facing stone wall is absorbing energy that will warm the coop through a night that its builder may not live to see. That is a different relationship with time than any mechanical heating system offers, and it points toward a broader philosophy about what it means to build something that lasts. Watch the morning coop routine on an Amish farm in the first week of January, and you will see something that a time-use researcher would classify as labor, but that the participants would never describe that way. The farmer's eldest son, perhaps 14 years old, is carrying the first pair of heated stones across the yard in a burlap sling, while his younger sister holds the coop door against the wind. Their father has already checked the heat wall's interior surface with the flat of his hand, pressing his palm against the stone the way a baker tests bread, reading the residual warmth from yesterday's solar gain with a sensitivity that took years to develop. Their grandmother, who has managed this flock longer than the father has been farming, is already inside the coop, assessing the birds before the stones arrive, because she wants the stones placed where she decides, not where habit puts them. This is not an idealized portrait. It is the functional reality of a heating system whose effectiveness depends entirely on human consistency, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and the kind of coordinated daily effort that only works inside a community with strong mutual accountability. The hot rock and heat wall systems require nothing from the electrical grid, nothing from a fuel supplier, and nothing from a hardware store, but they require something that modern heating systems specifically eliminate from the equation: people who know what they are doing and show up every morning to do it. That requirement is simultaneously the system's greatest vulnerability and its deepest strength. Amish mutual aid, documented extensively by scholars including Crable and by journalists who have spent time embedded in Lancaster County communities, operates through a set of institutions that have no direct equivalent in secular American life. The barn raising is the most famous of these, an event where 100 or more neighbors assemble to construct a complete barn frame in a single day. But the same logic runs through smaller and less visible forms of community support. When a farmer is injured during planting season, neighbors appear to finish the planting without being asked. When a family's flock is devastated by disease, community members contribute replacement birds. When an elderly farmer can no longer carry heated stones to the coop, the task migrates to younger hands without formal negotiation or recorded obligation. Beyond that, the knowledge embedded in the stone heating routine is transmitted through participation rather than instruction, which is the oldest and most reliable form of education that human communities have ever developed. A child who has carried heated stones across a snowy yard every January morning from age 6 onward does not need to be taught the principles of thermal mass at age 25. The knowledge lives in the body, in the weight of the stone through the burlap, in the feel of the coop's air temperature against the face when the door opens, in the sound a stone makes when it has cooled too far to be useful and needs to go back to the hearth. This embodied knowledge is precisely what is lost when a farmer installs an electric heat lamp and removes the daily human engagement with the coop's thermal state. The social texture of the stone heating routine extends outward from the immediate family into the broader community through channels that are easy to miss if you are looking only at the agricultural mechanics. Decisions about stone selection, placement strategy, and seasonal timing are subjects of conversation at community gatherings throughout the winter, not as abstract discussion, but as the practical exchange of observations between farmers managing similar flocks in similar conditions. A farmer who noticed that a particular limestone outcropping on his property produced stones that held heat longer than the creekbed granite he had been using for 20 years will mention it to his neighbor at a church gathering, and that observation will spread through the community within a season. Tested and evaluated and either confirmed or refined by a dozen other farmers before the next winter begins. The economics of this social knowledge network are genuinely difficult to quantify, but are no less real for that difficulty. A piece of agricultural information that spreads through a community of 300 farming families without any commercial infrastructure, without a newsletter, a website, or a paid consultant, and that is tested against real conditions by dozens of practitioners before being widely adopted, is a form of collective intelligence that modern agricultural extension services spend considerable resources trying to replicate. The Amish have it as a structural feature of their community organization, not as a program or an initiative, but as the natural byproduct of a community that gathers regularly, works together routinely, and measures its members' knowledge against real winter outcomes every single year. Here is the thing that strikes outside observers most forcefully when they spend time watching this system operate. The stone heating routine is not experienced by its participants as a burden that technology should eventually replace. It is experienced as a form of productive connection between generations, between neighbors, and between the farm family and the specific physical landscape of their property. The creek that produced the stones, the woodlot that fuels the stove, the south-facing slope that determines where the coop was built in the first place. Removing the labor would not liberate the farmer. It would sever the connections that the labor maintains, and in a community whose entire social architecture depends on those connections, that severance carries costs that no reduced heating bill could offset. The stones warming in the kitchen this morning are doing more than one kind of work, and the coop they will warm tonight holds more than one kind of value. Run the numbers on a modern electric heat lamp setup for a backyard chicken coop, and the arithmetic is unpleasant in a specific way that compounds annually. A single 250-watt heat lamp running continuously from November through March consumes roughly 900 kilowatt-hours of electricity across those 5 months, at an average American residential rate that has climbed past 15 cents per kilowatt-hour in most of the country, producing a seasonal heating bill of somewhere between $130 and $150 per lamp. A co-op large enough to house 40 birds comfortably typically requires 2 lamps to maintain adequate ambient temperature on the coldest nights, pushing the seasonal cost past $250 before accounting for the replacement bulbs that burn out every few months, or the occasional lamp failure that costs a farmer a flock on a night when the temperature drops to 0 and nobody notices until morning. That $250 seasonal figure does not include the infrastructure cost of running electrical service to an outbuilding, which in rural areas can range from several hundred to several $1,000s depending on the distance from the main panel, the local permit requirements, and whether the work is done by a licensed electrician or by the farmer himself. It does not include the cost of the lamp fixtures, the protective cages that prevent fire when birds roost too close to a heat source, or the fire insurance premium increase that many rural insurers apply to outbuildings with active electrical heating equipment. Coop fires caused by heat lamps are a genuine and documented hazard. Reported regularly in Agricultural Extension Service safety bulletins across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states, and the financial and emotional cost of losing a flock and a structure to an electrical fire dwarfs any seasonal heating savings a farmer might have hoped to achieve. Against this sat the capital cost of a thermal mass stone wall built from field stone gathered on the farm property. The stone costs nothing beyond the labor of gathering it. Lime mortar, the traditional Amish binding material, costs a fraction of modern cement and is mixed on-site from locally sourced limestone that many Lancaster County farms produce or can source from a neighbor. The labor of construction, as described in the previous section, is provided by the community at no cash cost to the individual farmer. A well-built fieldstone wall of 18-inch thickness, constructed by competent hands using sound materials, will remain structurally sound and thermally functional for well over a century without maintenance, repointing, or replacement. The Amish communities of Lancaster County contain farm buildings whose stone walls were laid in the 1700s and are still in active agricultural use today. What's more, the thermal mass system carries no ongoing operating cost whatsoever once the wall is built and the stones are selected. The sun that charges the heat wall on a January afternoon costs the farmer nothing. The wood that heats the kitchen stove where the portable stones are warmed is sourced from the farm's own woodlot, managed as a renewable resource across a rotation that replenishes the cut timber within a generation. A farmer who heats his Coops stones with wood he cut himself from trees he grew himself on land he owns outright has achieved a heating system whose marginal cost per winter approaches zero, a figure that no utility-dependent system can match, regardless of how efficient the equipment becomes. The multi-generational dimension of the stone investment sharpens the economic comparison further. A heat lamp purchased today will be obsolete or worn out within 5 years. The electrical infrastructure serving it may last 20 or 30 years before requiring upgrade. The thermal mass wall built this autumn, if constructed properly, will serve the farm's chicken operation for 100 winters, heating flock after flock for generations of farmers who will never pay a heating bill for the privilege. Expressed as an annualized cost across a 100-year service life, even a fieldstone wall that required significant cash outlay for professional mason labor would cost a few dollars per year in heating service, a figure so small relative to the annual egg revenue of the flock it protects that it becomes essentially invisible in the farm's economic accounting. The hidden cost comparison extends into risk management in ways that purely financial calculations tend to undervalue. An electric heating system creates a single point of failure whose consequences are catastrophic and rapid. A power outage on the coldest night of the year, a tripped breaker, a lamp that burns out silently after the farmer has gone to bed, any of these events can result in the loss of an entire flock within hours. A thermal mass system has no single point of failure. The heat wall does not trip a breaker. The heated stones do not burn out. If a farmer is sick and cannot carry stones on a particular morning, the heat wall continues to release yesterday's solar gain. The deep litter continues its microbial composting, the birds continue sharing body heat on the roost, and the flock survives on the accumulated thermal reserves of a system that was designed from the beginning to degrade gracefully rather than fail catastrophically. Here is the thing that Amish farmers understand about economics that the quarterly earnings culture of modern agriculture tends to obscure. The most expensive system is not the one with the highest upfront cost. It is the one that fails at the worst possible moment and takes irreplaceable value with it when it goes. A flock of 40 laying hens represents not just their current egg output, but the accumulated genetic selection of years of breeding, the investment of a full summer's feed costs, and the foundation of the household's winter protein supply. Losing that flock to a heat lamp failure in January is a financial event whose true cost includes everything the birds would have produced through the following spring and summer, a figure that makes the apparent savings of an electric system look considerably less attractive than the monthly utility bill suggested. Bend down and push your hand into the floor of a well-managed Amish chicken coop in February, and you will feel something that stops most visitors cold. Warmth rising from below. Not the warmth of a heating element or a buried pipe, but a gentle, living warmth that comes from several inches of bedding material in a state of active biological transformation, exhaling heat the way a compost pile exhales heat, because that is precisely what it is. The floor of this coop is not dirty. It is deliberately, carefully, and systematically alive, and the life inside it is doing work that no mechanical system can replicate at zero operating cost. The deep litter method is a bedding management practice in which fresh material is added periodically to an existing base, rather than removed and replaced on a regular cleaning schedule. As the bedding accumulates and the lower layers compact under the weight of birds and fresh additions, The organic material in those lower layers begins to decompose through the action of bacteria and fungi already present in the environment. That decomposition process releases heat as a byproduct, in the same way that a garden compost pile generates internal warmth sufficient to steam on a cold morning. In a well-managed deep litter system, the bedding temperature several inches below the surface can run measurably above ambient air temperature, contributing a consistent and passive heat source to the coop's thermal environment through the coldest months of the year. The practice has a documented history in American poultry science that predates most modern chicken keepers' awareness of it. Researchers at the Ohio Agricultural Experiment Station conducted systematic studies of built-up litter management in the 1940s and 1950s, measuring its effects on bird health, disease rates, and co-op temperature across multiple winter seasons. Their findings established that properly managed deep litter not only generated useful heat but also supported bird health in ways that clean floor systems did not, a result that surprised the researchers enough that they repeated their measurements across several experimental cycles before publishing. The Amish had been practicing the method for generations before those studies were designed, not because they had read the Ohio research, but because generations of winter observation had already told them what the researchers would eventually confirm. What the Ohio researchers found, and what subsequent poultry science has continued to document, is that the deep litter floor is not simply warm. It is biologically active in ways that directly benefit the birds living above it. The bacterial and fungal communities that drive decomposition in a healthy litter system produce compounds that suppress the growth of certain poultry pathogens, functioning as a kind of living floor-level immune system for the flock. Salmonella and certain other bacterial threats that flourish in the sterile, frequently cleaned floors of commercial poultry operations find the competitive microbial environment of a deep litter system inhospitable, because the decomposer community occupies the ecological niches that pathogens would otherwise exploit. Research has found that flocks managed on deep litter show reduced rates of certain bacterial infections compared to flocks on regularly cleaned floors, a counterintuitive result that challenges the intuitive equation of cleanliness with health. Just imagine the practical implications of this for a farm family managing a flock through winter without access to veterinary services on short notice. A floor system that actively suppresses certain pathogens is a form of disease management that requires no medication, no diagnosis, no supply chain, and no cash expenditure. It operates continuously through the night and through blizzards and through the weeks when a farmer is occupied with other urgent work and cannot give the coop daily attention. The biological insurance it provides is not absolute, since deep litter systems can fail if mismanaged, but its baseline protection is genuine and its cost is zero beyond the initial bedding material. The heat generation of a deep litter system is not uniform or unlimited, and experienced practitioners are careful not to overstate what the floor can contribute to the co-op's overall thermal budget. On a night when the outdoor temperature falls to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, the deep litter's contribution will not compensate for absent wall insulation or a poorly designed coop. What it provides is a consistent baseline heat source that reduces the thermal load on the other passive systems, requiring slightly less solar gain from the heat wall, slightly less radiant output from the heated stones, and slightly less metabolic output from the birds themselves to maintain a survivable interior temperature. In a system where every component works together and no single element is asked to carry the entire burden alone, that contribution is more valuable than its modest absolute magnitude suggests. The composting floor also performs a function that connects the chicken coop directly to the farm's broader agricultural productivity in a way that no electric heating system can match. Throughout the winter, the deep litter is accumulating a concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from bird droppings, uneaten feed, and decomposing organic material that will, by spring, have transformed into one of the most fertile soil amendments available to a vegetable gardener. A single winter's worth of deep litter from a 40-bird flock, turned out onto the kitchen garden beds in March, delivers a nutrient load equivalent to a substantial quantity of commercial fertilizer at a cost of nothing beyond the labor of moving it. The coop floor that kept the birds warm through February is simultaneously preparing the soil that will feed the family through August, closing a loop between animal husbandry and plant production that the best agricultural engineers in the world are still trying to replicate efficiently at industrial scale. Crouch at the edge of a healthy deep litter floor and look at it the way a soil scientist looks at a forest floor, because that is functionally what it is. The surface layer is loose and dry, scratched continuously by 40 pairs of feet into a fine, friable texture that the birds clearly enjoy working through in their search for seeds, insects, and the microscopic organisms that concentrate in decomposing organic material. 2 inches below the surface, the material is darker, more compressed, and warmer to the touch. 4 inches down, it is darker still, held together by fungal threads visible as white filaments running through the matrix, and the temperature registered by a meat thermometer pressed into this layer on a cold January morning can read 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient air temperature in the coop above it. This vertical temperature gradient is not incidental. It is the structural signature of a functioning microbial ecosystem, and the organisms creating it are performing chemistry of genuine sophistication. Bacteria in the genera Bacillus and Lactobacillus, along with a shifting community of fungi and actinomycetes, the same fibrous organisms that give healthy garden soil its distinctive earthy smell, break down the complex organic molecules in chicken droppings and bedding material through enzymatic processes that release energy as heat. The rate of heat production depends on moisture content, oxygen availability, carbon to nitrogen ratio, and the diversity of the microbial community present, which is why deep litter management is a skill rather than simply a practice. Getting the biology right requires consistent attention to conditions that the organisms themselves communicate through temperature, smell, and texture rather than through any instrument a farmer needs to purchase. The disease suppression function of a healthy deep litter community operates through a principle that ecologists call competitive exclusion, the same principle that makes a dense, diverse forest floor resistant to invasive plant species. When a microbial community is rich, diverse, and actively metabolizing, it occupies the available nutrients, moisture, and physical space so completely that a pathogenic organism introduced from outside struggles to establish a population large enough to cause disease. Research published in poultry science literature over the past several decades has documented reduced prevalence of Salmonella, Campylobacter, and certain coccidial parasites in deep litter systems compared to conventional cleaned floor systems, with the competitive microbial environment of the litter identified as a contributing factor. The floor is not sterile, but its complexity is precisely what makes it protective. What's more, the birds themselves participate actively in maintaining the litter's biological health through a behavior that looks like recreation, but serves a genuine physiological function. Dust bathing, in which a chicken excavates a shallow depression in loose material and throws it vigorously over her body with her wings, is not merely a comfort behavior. It distributes the bird's natural skin oils and preening secretions through the litter, adds organic compounds that feed the microbial community, and introduces the bird's own commensal skin bacteria into the floor environment where they join and enrich the existing decomposer community. A flock that dust bathes regularly in well-managed deep litter is continuously inoculating the floor with beneficial organisms and simultaneously maintaining the loose surface texture that allows oxygen to penetrate into the upper litter layers, keeping the aerobic decomposition process running efficiently. The Lactobacillus species present in healthy deep litter deserve specific mention because their role extends beyond simple decomposition. Lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid as a metabolic byproduct, and lactic acid creates a mildly acidic microenvironment in the immediate vicinity of each bacterial colony that is inhospitable to many pathogenic organisms, including several strains of Salmonella that thrive at neutral pH. Birds that scratch and forage in lactobacillus-rich litter ingest these organisms continuously, and research has documented that gut colonization by beneficial lactobacillus strains improves feed conversion efficiency, meaning that a bird with a healthy gut microbiome extracts more usable nutrition from each gram of feed than a bird with a depleted gut community. In winter, when feed efficiency is already under pressure from the competing demands of thermoregulation, that improvement in digestive efficiency has a direct and measurable effect on the bird's ability to maintain body condition and egg production simultaneously. However, the deep litter system's benefits are entirely conditional on the moisture management that keeps the microbial community in its productive aerobic state, rather than tipping it into the anaerobic state that produces ammonia and creates exactly the respiratory hazard described in an earlier section of this story. A deep litter floor that is too wet does not compost. It putrefies, shifting from an oxygen-driven decomposition process dominated by beneficial aerobic bacteria to a sulfur and nitrogen-driven process dominated by anaerobic bacteria that produce ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other respiratory irritants at concentrations that damage bird health rapidly. The difference between a deep litter floor that protects a flock through winter and one that slowly poisons it is a matter of moisture management so precise that experienced Amish farm wives describe it as a feel rather than a measurement. A tactile judgment refined across years of daily contact with the material that no moisture meter captures as reliably as a practiced hand. That practiced hand is the connection between the living floor and the farm's human community, the thread that runs from grandmother to granddaughter through the specific sensory knowledge of what healthy litter feels like, smells like, and sounds like when a boot heel presses into it. It is knowledge that cannot be purchased, downloaded, or installed, and its transfer requires exactly the kind of daily proximity between generations that the Amish community structure makes possible, and that modern agricultural industrialization has systematically eliminated. The living floor and the community that tends it are not separable, and understanding one requires understanding the other, which is why the next question about moisture management leads directly back to the human judgment that governs it. Press your fingers into the surface of a well-managed deep litter floor and withdraw them slowly, watching how the material behaves. In a healthy system, the litter springs back loosely after the pressure is released, holds its shape briefly around the impression, and leaves the fingers dry. Now imagine squeezing a handful of that same material in your closed fist with firm, steady pressure. If a single drop of moisture appears between your fingers, the litter is exactly right. If water runs freely, the system is dangerously wet. If the material crumbles to dust without any cohesion at all, it is too dry for efficient microbial activity and needs a careful addition of moisture to restart the biological process. This is the wrung-out sponge test, and it is the primary diagnostic tool that experienced Amish farm wives apply every morning when they open the coop door, before they look at the birds, before they check the feed or the water, because the floor's condition governs everything else that happens inside that coop through the winter. The moisture content of deep litter sits at the intersection of several competing forces that push in different directions simultaneously. 40 birds breathing, drinking, and producing droppings add moisture to the coop environment continuously, and that moisture migrates downward into the litter through gravity and upward into the air through evaporation. Fresh bedding material added to the surface is typically dry, and its absorption capacity temporarily increases the litter's ability to handle incoming moisture. Cold temperatures slow evaporation from the litter surface, meaning that winter moisture management is more demanding than summer management, because the natural evaporative mechanism that helps regulate moisture in warm weather operates at reduced efficiency precisely when the birds are spending more time inside and producing more droppings per square foot of floor space than at any other time of year. Bedding material selection is the first and most important moisture management decision a farmer makes, and different materials carry significantly different absorption capacities that affect how the system performs through a long winter. Pine shavings, the most widely available commercial bedding material in American feed stores, absorb moisture efficiently and maintain their structural looseness under moderate compaction, allowing oxygen to continue penetrating the upper litter layers even after weeks of bird traffic. Wheat straw, which many Amish farms produce on-site and therefore favor for economic reasons, has a hollow stem structure that provides good initial absorption, but collapses under sustained compaction, forming dense mats that exclude oxygen and create anaerobic pockets where ammonia-producing bacteria thrive. Managing a straw-based deep litter system through a hard winter requires more frequent surface agitation than a pine shaving system, a labor cost that experienced farmers account for in their material choice. Cedar shavings deserve a specific warning here because their apparent similarity to pine shavings leads beginning chicken keepers to use them as a substitute that carries a genuine hazard. The aromatic oils that give cedar its characteristic smell, primarily thujaplicins and cedrol, are respiratory irritants that damage the delicate mucous membranes of a chicken's airways at concentrations that accumulate rapidly in an enclosed coop. A chicken keeper who fills a winter coop with cedar shavings is solving a moisture problem while creating a respiratory one, and the resulting damage to the bird's first line of immune defense connects directly back to the ammonia and pathogen vulnerability described earlier. Food-grade pine shavings, wheat straw managed with frequent turning, and dried leaves gathered from the farm's woodlot are the materials that experienced Amish practitioners use, each chosen for its specific combination of absorption capacity, cost, availability, and safety. The physical act of managing litter moisture through a winter requires a specific routine that begins with observation and ends with decisive intervention before the system tips toward the anaerobic state. Every morning, the farmer or farm wife walks the entire floor area of the coop, pressing a boot heel into different zones to feel for soft, wet spots that indicate moisture accumulation. Wet zones form predictably near the waterer, beneath the heaviest roost traffic areas, and in corners where air circulation is lowest and evaporation is slowest. When a wet zone is identified, the response is immediate. Dry material is pulled from a drier area and layered over the wet zone. The surface is agitated with a pitchfork to open channels for airflow, and if the wet area is severe enough, a handful of food-grade diatomaceous earth, a fine white powder made from fossilized microscopic algae called diatoms, is broadcast over the surface to accelerate moisture absorption and suppress the initial stages of anaerobic bacterial activity. Diatomaceous earth earns its place in this system through a combination of physical properties that make it uniquely useful in the specific conditions of a winter coop floor. Its microscopic structure, the intricate silica shells of individual diatom organisms visible only under magnification, creates an enormous surface area per unit of weight that absorbs moisture with exceptional efficiency. At the same time, those sharp silica edges mechanically damage the exoskeletons of soft-bodied pests including mites, lice, and certain beetle larvae that colonize damp litter and cause significant irritation and blood loss in confined poultry. Food-grade diatomaceous earth, as opposed to the pool filter grade that is chemically treated and dangerous to animals, is safe for use around chickens when applied carefully, though it is a respiratory irritant for both birds and humans in concentrated airborne form and should never be broadcast in quantities that raise visible dust clouds inside an occupied coop. The timing of fresh bedding additions follows a rhythm that experienced practitioners calibrate to the specific biology of their litter system rather than to a fixed calendar schedule. Because no two winters produce identical moisture loads and no two coop environments age their litter at exactly the same rate. As a general principle, fresh material is added when the surface layer has compacted enough that the birds can no longer scratch it into the loose, active texture that signals good aerobic conditions. Typically, every 1 to 3 weeks depending on stocking density, weather conditions, and the absorbency of the bedding material in use. The goal at every addition is to restore the surface looseness that allows oxygen penetration without disrupting the lower layers where the most active composting and heat generation are occurring, because disturbing those lower layers too aggressively can introduce oxygen to anaerobic pockets in ways that temporarily spike ammonia production before the aerobic community reestablishes. Managing this system well is a continuous conversation between the farmer and the floor, conducted in the language of temperature, texture, and smell, and the fluency required to hold that conversation reliably through a hard winter is built across years rather than read from a page. The farmers who get the most from a deep litter system are not the ones who started in November when the cold arrives and forces the issue. They are the ones who began building it in late August, when the summer heat was still thick enough to jumpstart microbial activity in fresh bedding material before the first frost could slow the biology down to a pace too leisurely to generate useful warmth. Starting the litter 8 to 10 weeks before the first expected hard freeze gives the microbial community time to establish itself, diversify, and reach a metabolic tempo sufficient to produce measurable heat by the time the temperature outside drops to the point where that heat becomes critical. A litter system started in late August is a mature, active biological engine by mid-November. A litter system started in November is still struggling to establish itself through the coldest months, running at a fraction of its potential heat output precisely when the flock needs it most. This timing insight is one of the clearest examples of how Amish winter management operates on a seasonal logic that begins long before winter itself is visible on the horizon. In a community where the farming year is managed as a continuous integrated whole rather than as a series of separate seasonal episodes, the preparation for February begins in August, the same way the preparation for harvest begins in March. The calendar is not divided into growing season and off-season. It is understood as a single cycle in which every month's actions carry consequences that will be felt 3 or 4 months later, and the deep litter floor is one of the clearest expressions of that long-cycle thinking in the entire suite of Amish farming practices. The specific chemistry of what happens inside a well-timed deep litter system through a full winter is worth pausing on, because it connects the chicken coop to the garden in a way that most backyard farmers never fully appreciate. As the lower layers of the litter system decompose through the winter months, the complex organic molecules in chicken droppings, primarily uric acid rather than the urea found in mammalian urine, are broken down by bacteria into forms that plants can absorb directly through their roots. Nitrogen, the nutrient most responsible for leafy green growth and the one most quickly depleted from garden soils under continuous cultivation, concentrates in the decomposing litter at levels that make the finished product one of the most nitrogen-rich organic soil amendments available to a home gardener. Phosphorus, essential for root development and fruit set, accumulates alongside it. Potassium, which governs disease resistance and water regulation in plants, rounds out a nutrient profile that mirrors the composition of expensive commercial fertilizers closely enough that agricultural chemists have measured the comparison and found it favorable. A single winter's output from a 40-bird flock managed on deep litter represents a soil amendment resource of genuine agricultural significance. By the time the coop is cleaned out in March, the accumulated litter, typically running to a depth of 8 to 12 inches after a full winter of additions, contains several hundred pounds of partially composted organic material whose nutrient density has been built up through months of biological activity. Spread across a kitchen garden of modest size, that material provides a nutrient input that would require a substantial cash outlay to replace with commercial products, connecting the winter chicken operation directly to the summer vegetable garden in an economic loop that makes each system more valuable than it would be operating independently. However, the transition from winter litter to garden amendment is not as simple as shoveling the floor contents onto the beds and planting into them immediately. Fresh or partially composted chicken manure is nitrogen-rich enough to burn plant roots through a process called fertilizer burn, in which the ammonia released during the final stages of decomposition damages root tissue and stunts growth in young seedlings. The traditional Amish practice is to spread the cleaned-out litter onto fallow garden beds in March, turn it lightly into the top few inches of soil, and allow it to complete its decomposition through April before planting begins in May. This 4 to 6 week finishing period, during which soil microorganisms continue the biological work begun in the coop floor, converts the remaining ammonia into stable nitrate forms that plants absorb without damage, while simultaneously inoculating the garden soil with the diverse microbial community that has been developing in the litter through the winter. The spring garden beds that receive this treatment are visibly different from beds that were not amended within weeks of planting. Soil structure improves as the organic material provides physical scaffolding for the microscopic channels through which water and air move through the root zone. Water retention increases, reducing the irrigation demand during dry spells in June and July. The diverse microbial community from the litter establishes itself in the garden soil and suppresses certain soil-borne plant pathogens through the same competitive exclusion mechanism that operates on the coop floor, reducing the incidence of damping off disease in seedlings and root rot in established plants. The chicken coop and the kitchen garden are not separate operations on an Amish farm. They are two components of a single biological system, whose inputs and outputs flow between them in a cycle that makes both more productive than either could be in isolation. Even stranger is the way this cycle reshapes the economic accounting of the winter chicken operation when viewed at the whole farm level. A farmer who calculates the cost of keeping 40 hens through a Pennsylvania winter by adding up feed costs and subtracting egg revenue is missing the garden amendment value entirely, which on a farm that would otherwise need to purchase commercial fertilizer for a large kitchen garden represents a genuine cash saving that belongs in the winter flock's revenue column. The deep litter system produces not one output but two: eggs through the winter months and soil fertility through the summer growing season, and the second output costs nothing beyond the labor of spreading it. This double return on a single biological system is the kind of efficiency that agricultural economists call elegant and that Amish farmers simply call Tuesday. Before any heat source does its work inside a chicken coop, something has to keep that heat from escaping through the walls, the roof, the floor, and every gap between them, because a heating system without insulation is simply a device for warming the outdoors at the farmer's expense. The Amish approach to co-op insulation draws on the same materials that Northern European and American farmers used for centuries before fiberglass bats and spray foam existed, and several of those materials perform with a physical efficiency that modern building scientists have measured, documented, and in some cases been surprised by. The surprise is not that the old materials work, it is how well they work and why. Straw is the foundational insulation material in traditional Amish COP construction, used in several distinct forms that exploit its insulating properties in different ways depending on where in the building envelope it is applied. The insulating value of straw comes from its structure rather than from any inherent property of the plant material itself. A straw stem is a hollow tube, and when packed together in bales or loose bundles, individual stems trap small pockets of still air between and within them. Still air is one of the most effective thermal insulators available in nature, which is why fiberglass insulation works on exactly the same principle, trapping air within a matrix of fine fibers rather than within hollow plant stems. Straw bale construction, in which entire wall sections are built from tightly packed bales, achieves measured thermal resistance values that compare favorably with standard residential framing filled with fiberglass bats, a fact documented in building science literature and in the energy codes of several American states that have formally approved straw bale construction as a legitimate building method. The practical limitation of loose straw as a wall insulation material is its vulnerability to moisture infiltration, which compresses the air pockets that provide the insulating value and creates conditions favorable for mold growth within the wall cavity. Amish cope builders address this through two complementary strategies. The first is a double-wall construction method in which two parallel vertical surfaces, typically rough-sawn lumber planks, are built with a gap of 4 to 6 inches between them, and that cavity is packed tightly with dry straw that is compressed enough to resist settling but loose enough to maintain its air-trapping structure. The outer wall surface is then sealed against weather infiltration with overlapping boards, split shingles, or in some communities a lime-based render that allows the wall to breathe while shedding liquid water. The second strategy is the use of wool, specifically raw fleece in its unwashed state, as an alternative or supplemental insulation material in areas where moisture is a particular concern. Wool's thermal performance in damp conditions is one of the genuinely remarkable properties of the fiber, documented extensively in textile science and relevant to agricultural insulation for reasons that become clear once the physics are understood. A wool fiber can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture vapor before it begins to feel wet to the touch, and during that absorption process it releases a small amount of heat through a phenomenon called the heat absorption, the energy released when water molecules bind to the protein structure of the fiber. This means that wool insulation in a damp environment is not merely tolerating the moisture. It is actively generating a small amount of heat in response to it, a property that no synthetic insulation material replicates, and that makes wool uniquely suited to the specific moisture-rich environment of a winter chicken coop where synthetic materials might become saturated and lose their insulating value entirely. The chinking of gaps between wall timbers is a construction practice drawn directly from traditional log building technique, documented in historical American and Northern European vernacular architecture from the earliest colonial settlements forward. In a coop built from rough sawn or hand-hewn logs or heavy timbers, the gaps between individual members are filled with a mixture of clay, chopped straw, and sometimes animal hair pressed firmly into the joint and allowed to dry to a hard, weather-resistant plug. This mixture, known generically as chinking, has a thermal resistance modest in absolute terms, but significant in practice, because the gaps it seals are the points of highest air infiltration in the building envelope. And air infiltration, the movement of outdoor cold air directly into the interior space, is a more immediate threat to interior temperature than conductive heat loss through a solid wall. A well-chinked coop loses less heat through its gaps than a poorly chinked coop with thicker walls, because the insulating value of even excellent wall material is largely irrelevant if cold air is bypassing it entirely through open joints. The roof presents a specific insulation challenge in cold climates because heat rises, and the ceiling is the surface through which the greatest proportion of interior warmth escapes in an uninsulated building. Amish coop roofs in the coldest settlements use several overlapping strategies to address this. A layer of loose straw packed into the space between the ceiling boards and the roof surface provides the primary thermal barrier. In some constructions, this straw layer is held in place by a secondary interior ceiling of rough boards, nailed across the rafters below the main ceiling plane, creating a sealed cavity that prevents the straw from shifting under the weight of snow accumulating on the roof above. Beyond that, a heavy snow load on the roof is not simply a structural challenge to be managed. It is an additional insulation layer whose value experienced Amish farmers recognize explicitly, because snow, like straw and wool, traps air within its crystal structure and achieves a thermal resistance per inch that building scientists have measured at values comparable to loose-fill cellulose insulation. The floor is the final element in the insulation envelope, and the one most often underestimated by beginning coop builders who focus their efforts on walls and roof, while leaving the ground beneath the birds as a direct thermal connection to the frozen earth below. An earthen floor in direct contact with the frozen ground in January is a continuous heat sink, drawing warmth downward from the coop interior through conduction at a rate that can substantially offset the contributions of every other passive heating system in the building. The traditional Amish solution is a raised floor platform of thick planking set on stone or timber sills that lift the floor surface several inches above ground level, breaking the direct conductive connection to the frozen earth and creating a dead air space beneath the floor that provides additional thermal resistance. Around the perimeter of this raised floor, straw bales are stacked against the exterior foundation to prevent cold air from circulating beneath the floor from outside, sealing the dead air space into a still, thermally stable pocket that the frozen ground cannot easily penetrate. The door of a chicken coop is the building's single greatest daily thermal liability, not because of its construction, but because of its use. Every time a farmer opens the coop door to collect eggs, add feed, check water, or carry in heated stones, a column of warm interior air rushes outward at the top of the opening, while cold exterior air floods inward at the bottom, a convective exchange that can drop the interior temperature by several degrees in under a minute on a still day, and faster than that in a wind. Multiply this across the 4 or 5 daily entries a well-managed winter coop requires, and the cumulative heat loss through the door, opening alone, represents a significant fraction of the total thermal budget that every other passive system is working to maintain. The Amish solution to this problem is architectural rather than behavioral, and it is borrowed directly from a building technique used in cold-climate human dwellings across northern Europe for centuries. The airlock entry, sometimes called a cold porch or a mud vestibule in residential construction, interposes a small enclosed transitional space between the exterior and the interior of the building, so that the outer door must be fully closed before the inner door is opened. In a co-op context, this vestibule is typically a simple framed addition of 4 to 6 square feet attached to the main co-op entrance, large enough for one person to stand inside while carrying a feed bucket or a pair of heated stones, with a door on each end that opens inward toward the coop interior so that wind pressure keeps both doors seated firmly in their frames rather than forcing them open. When a farmer enters, the outer door closes behind them before the inner door is opened, and the brief equalization of temperature in the vestibule means that the air entering the main cope space has already been partially warmed rather than arriving at full outdoor temperature. The heat saved by this simple addition across a winter of daily entries is not trivial. The pop door, a small hinged opening set low in the coop wall through which birds pass to access the outdoor run, addresses a different but related problem. A full-sized human door left open for bird traffic during the day is a continuous heat loss that no passive system can compensate for. But birds do not require a human-scale opening. A pop door measuring roughly 12 inches wide by 14 inches tall, sized to allow a large hen to pass through comfortably without providing enough clearance for significant air mass exchange, reduces the convective heat loss during bird access to a fraction of what a full door would produce. Closing the pop door at dusk, before the outdoor temperature reaches its overnight minimum, is one of the most effective single actions a farmer can take to protect the coop's thermal envelope through the coldest hours. And in Amish communities, this closing is treated with the same non-negotiable regularity as latching the barn at night. Windows in a winter coop serve two competing functions that sit in direct tension with each other. On the south-facing wall, glazed openings allow winter sunlight to reach the heat wall and the interior floor, contributing solar gain to the coop's thermal budget during daylight hours. On every other wall orientation, windows are potential thermal weak points where heat escapes through the glazing by conduction, because glass conducts heat roughly 30 times faster than an equivalent thickness of wood and hundreds of times faster than an equivalent thickness of straw insulation. The Amish approach to this tension is to maximize south-facing glazing for solar gain while minimizing or eliminating windows on north, east, and west walls, and to insulate south-facing windows from the interior during overnight hours using removable straw-filled panels that are lifted into place after the sun sets and removed again each morning. These insulating panels, sometimes called shutter boards in the traditional building vocabulary of Lancaster County, are typically simple wooden frames filled with tightly packed straw and covered on both faces with burlap or rough canvas to hold the fill material in place. Their thermal resistance per inch is modest, but their effect on the overall window's overnight heat loss is substantial because they are being applied at the surface where the thermal resistance is lowest, the glass itself, and they trap a layer of still air between the panel and the glass that functions as an additional insulating barrier. A south-facing window that contributes positive solar gain through the day and is insulated to near-wall performance through the night is, across a full 24-hour winter cycle, a net thermal asset rather than a liability, which is the design goal the Amish window management system achieves through daily human effort rather than through expensive double or triple glazing. The floor perimeter, where the bottom of the wall meets the ground surface outside the coop, is a point of particular vulnerability that less experienced builders tend to overlook because it is neither as visible nor as intuitive as the walls and roof. Cold ground in contact with the base of a wooden wall conducts heat out of the wall's lower section continuously, and cold air moving through the perimeter gap between the floor platform and the ground surface circulates beneath the raised floor and removes the dead air insulation value that the raised floor design is intended to provide. Straw bales stacked against the exterior base of the coop walls from ground level to the bottom of the wall siding address both of these pathways simultaneously, insulating the wall base against conductive heat loss and blocking the airflow beneath the floor that would otherwise strip away the dead air layer. In communities where straw is a farm-produced material rather than a purchased one, this perimeter baling is applied with a generosity that a farmer paying cash for commercial insulation materials might hesitate to match, and that generosity shows in the winter performance of the co-op. The cumulative effect of these door, window, and perimeter details is a building envelope that performs far better than its simple materials suggest, not because any single element is extraordinary, but because each element addresses a specific heat loss pathway that the others cannot cover. A co-op with excellent wall insulation, but a poorly sealed door perimeter, loses heat as fast through the gap at the door's base as through several square feet of uninsulated wall. A cope with a well-insulated door but unshuttered windows loses the solar gain that the heat wall needs to charge through the day. The Amish approach to co-op insulation is systems thinking expressed in straw and wood, and its effectiveness is the product of attention to every element simultaneously rather than excellence in any single one. That same systems thinking governs what happens inside the coop after the insulation holds the heat in, beginning with where the birds themselves spend the night and how their bodies are designed to survive it. Heat rises. This is not a metaphor or a folk saying, but a straightforward consequence of the physical property that makes warm air less dense than cool air, causing it to move upward through any enclosed space until it reaches the highest point available and accumulates there. In a chicken coop on a January night, this means that the warmest air in the building is concentrated near the ceiling, and the coldest air sits at floor level. And between those two extremes, a temperature gradient runs from bottom to top that can span 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit across a vertical distance of 4 feet in a well-insulated coop with no mechanical air circulation. A bird roosting at floor level is sleeping in the coldest air the coop contains. A bird roosting at 4 feet above the floor is sleeping in air measurably warmer than anything below it, without a single additional heat source required to produce that difference. Amish co-op builders exploit this physics with roost bars positioned at the highest point that the co-op's interior geometry allows while still leaving adequate clearance between the roost and the ceiling for birds to mount and dismount without injury. In a co-op with a 7-foot interior ceiling height, the primary roost bars typically run at 4 to 5 feet above the floor, placing the birds in the warmest thermal zone the building produces passively through nothing more than the physics of warm air accumulation. The positioning is not arbitrary, and it is not merely traditional. It is the practical application of a thermal principle that the farmers who developed this system understood through observation rather than through equations, watching over many winters which birds survived in better condition and tracing that advantage back to where they had been sleeping. The benefit of elevated roosting extends beyond simple access to warmer air. A bird sleeping above floor level is also sleeping above the ammonia that accumulates in the lowest air layers of the coop, above the drafts that move along the floor surface when wind pressure differentials cause air infiltration through the base of the walls, and above the moisture that condenses on cold floor surfaces and radiates upward as humid air that chills feathers far more effectively than dry, cold air of the same temperature. Elevation in a winter coop is a package of advantages that compound each other: warmer air, drier air, cleaner air, and reduced draft exposure, all achieved simultaneously through the placement of a wooden bar at the right height. The specific construction of the roost bar matters more than most beginning chicken keepers realize, and the detail that surprises almost every newcomer to cold weather poultry management is that the round wooden dowel or branch section that looks like the most natural perch for a bird is actually the worst choice for a cold climate coop. When a chicken perches on a round bar, its toes wrap around the underside of the bar and remain exposed to the cold air below. When a chicken perches on a flat bar, specifically a piece of standard lumber laid with the wide face upward, the bird's foot flattens against the surface and the toes spread out beneath the breast feathers that drape downward when the bird settles into roosting position. Those breast feathers cover the toes completely, providing the same insulation to the feet that a down comforter provides to human toes on a cold night. A chicken roosting on a flat 2x4 laid wide side up is sleeping with its feet inside its own insulation system. A chicken roosting on a round bar is sleeping with its feet hanging in cold air, exposed to the full overnight temperature regardless of how warm the rest of the coop becomes. Beyond that, the avian foot has its own thermal management system that operates independently of feather coverage, and represents one of the more elegant pieces of engineering in vertebrate biology. Birds that stand and perch in cold environments avoid heat loss through their legs and feet through a vascular mechanism called the ret mirabile, a Latin phrase meaning wonderful net, which describes a dense interlacing of arteries and veins in the lower leg where warm arterial blood flowing downward from the body transfers its heat directly to the cool venous blood flowing back upward through the vessel walls, before either stream reaches the foot. The result is that the foot is maintained at a temperature just above freezing, cool enough that the bird loses very little heat to the cold air surrounding the foot, but warm enough that tissue damage does not occur. The warm arterial blood that has given up its heat to the venous return arrives at the foot already cooled, loses little additional heat there, and the venous blood returning to the body has been pre-warmed enough that it does not chill the core when it rejoins the circulation. This countercurrent heat exchange system is the same mechanism that allows ducks to stand on ice without frostbite, that allows Arctic foxes and wolves to place their feet on frozen ground without tissue damage, and that allows a chicken roosting on a winter night to maintain core body temperature with a metabolic investment smaller than would be required without the mechanism. Flat roost bars enhance this system by reducing the surface area of the foot exposed to cold air, while round bars partially defeat it by holding the toes away from the breast feather coverage that would otherwise complete the thermal protection. The flat bar and the countercurrent circulation work together as a system, and recognizing them as a system rather than as separate details is the difference between a roost that genuinely contributes to winter survival and one that merely gives the bird somewhere to sleep. The height and design of the roost bars address the individual bird's thermal needs with impressive efficiency. But a flock is not a collection of individuals operating in isolation. It is a social group governed by hierarchies, preferences, and competitive dynamics that determine which bird sleeps where on any given night, and those social dynamics interact with the thermal physics of roosting in ways that require their own management strategy. Getting every bird into the warmest available roosting position is not simply a matter of building the right bars at the right height. It is a matter of understanding the social architecture of the flock well enough to design a roost system that accommodates every bird in the hierarchy, from the dominant rooster down to the lowest-ranking pullet, in a position warm enough to protect her through a January night. In 1921, a Norwegian zoologist named Thorleif Skjelderup Ebbe published a paper describing his observations of domestic chickens that introduced a concept so precise and so universally applicable that it became one of the foundational ideas of 20th-century animal behavior research. Skjelderup Ebbe had noticed that within any stable group of chickens, every individual bird occupies a specific rank in a linear dominance hierarchy in which each bird defers to those above it and dominates those below it without ambiguity or negotiation. He called this hierarchy the Hackordnung, a German word meaning hack order, which entered English as pecking order and subsequently escaped the barnyard entirely to describe dominance hierarchies in human organizations, corporate structures, military units, and social groups of every description. The concept that now governs how management consultants talk about office politics was first observed in a chicken yard in Norway, and it has direct consequences for how a flock distributes itself across a roost on a winter night. The pecking order governs roost position with the same authority it governs access to feed, water, and nesting boxes. Dominant birds, typically the senior rooster and the highest-ranking hens, claim the roost positions they prefer and displace lower-ranking birds from those positions without significant contest. In a coop with a single roost bar at a single height, the dominant birds occupy the warmest sections of the bar, which are the central positions farthest from the drafty ends near the walls, while lower-ranking birds are pushed to the periphery where temperatures are lower and draft exposure is higher. On the coldest nights, this social sorting can place the most vulnerable birds, typically young pullets in their first winter who sit at the bottom of the pecking order, in positions where they are genuinely at risk of cold stress, while the dominant birds sleep comfortably in the warmest available space. The Amish solution to this problem is a roost system designed to eliminate the single-tier competition that forces low-ranking birds into cold peripheral positions. A stepped roost, sometimes described informally as stadium seating among poultry keepers in Lancaster County communities, consists of multiple parallel bars set at staggered heights, with the lowest bar at approximately 2 feet above the floor and each successive bar set 8 to 10 inches higher and 8 to 10 inches back from the bar below it, rising in a staircase pattern toward the ceiling. This geometry accomplishes several things simultaneously that a single-level roost cannot. It distributes the flock vertically through the warmest air in the coop, rather than concentrating all birds at a single height. It provides enough total bar length that no bird is forced to roost in a genuinely exposed position for lack of space. And it creates a social landscape in which dominant birds sort themselves to the highest bars, which are indeed the warmest. while lower-ranking birds occupy the intermediate and lower bars, which are still elevated above the floor and substantially warmer than ground level, even if not as warm as the top tier. What's more, the staggered geometry of a stepped roost solves a sanitation problem that a single-level roost creates automatically. When multiple rows of birds sleep on bars at the same height, birds on the inner rows deposit droppings onto the backs of birds on the outer rows below them, a source of both moisture and pathogen exposure that compounds the health challenges of winter management. The stepped design ensures that each bar is set back and above the bar below it in a relationship that allows droppings to fall cleanly to the floor beneath the entire structure, rather than onto the birds roosting on lower bars. A droppings board, a flat surface of wood or metal installed beneath the lowest bar and extending outward to catch the overnight accumulation from all bars, makes morning cleanup straightforward and prevents the high nitrogen accumulation of droppings directly under the roost from creating a localized ammonia hotspot that would compromise the litter management system across the rest of the floor. The social dynamics of roosting extend into the transition period each evening when birds move from their daytime activities to their overnight positions. And this transition period is when the pecking order is most actively enforced and most relevant to the farmer's management decisions. Chickens are creatures of extraordinary habit in their roosting behavior, returning to the same bar and often to the same position on the same bar night after night, with a consistency that allows an observant farmer to notice immediately when a bird is roosting in an unusual position, since a bird that is ill, injured, or in early stages of cold stress often breaks from its established roosting routine before showing any other visible symptom of a problem. A bird that normally roosts at the top of the stepped system but is found on the lowest bar 3 mornings in a row is communicating something important about its physical condition, and a farmer who reads that behavioral signal correctly has the opportunity to intervene before the condition becomes a crisis. The roosting period itself runs from dusk to dawn, covering the 12 to 14 hours of a mid-January night during which the outdoor temperature reaches its minimum and the coop's passive thermal systems must sustain the interior environment without any solar input. During those hours, the flock is not simply sleeping. It is collectively managing its thermal environment through the aggregated body heat of 40 birds, packed closely enough together on the roost bars that each bird benefits from the radiant warmth of its neighbors. A bird roosting in contact with birds on either side of it loses heat from only 2 exposed sides rather than 4, reducing its metabolic burden by a proportion that translates directly into reduced feed consumption overnight and improved body condition in the morning. The roost bar, in this sense, is not just furniture. It is a social thermal management tool, and the density of birds on it is as important to its winter performance as its height, its width, or its placement in the coop. The connection between roosting behavior, social hierarchy, and thermal management loops back to the breed selection decisions discussed earlier in this story. Because cold-hardy breeds tend to be calmer and more tolerant of close roosting contact than flighty Mediterranean breeds that maintain larger individual space preferences, even in cold conditions. A flock of Wyandottes on a stepped roost in January will pack together with a cooperative density that a flock of Leghorns in the same conditions will resist, and the behavioral difference in roosting density produces a measurable difference in overnight co-op temperature that translates over the course of a winter into a difference in feed consumption, egg production, and flock health that the farmer experiences directly in the egg basket and the feed bin. Breed, roost design, and social dynamics are not separate variables in the winter management equation. They are a single interacting system, and the co-op environment that holds them all together depends, more than anything else, on getting one counterintuitive detail exactly right. Here's the single most dangerous piece of conventional wisdom in all of backyard chicken keeping, the one that kills more winter flocks than cold ever does on its own. A warm coop is a safe coop. Follow that instinct to its logical conclusion and you seal every gap, stuff every crack, nail boards across every vent opening, and pack the birds in as tightly as the floor space allows, congratulating yourself on the snug, draft-free environment you have created for them. What you have actually created is a sealed box filling steadily with moisture, ammonia, and carbon dioxide in which 40 tropical birds are slowly suffocating in air that grows more toxic with every hour the temperature outside keeps you from opening the door. The sealed coop does not protect the flock from winter. It concentrates everything that winter's reduced ventilation makes dangerous and delivers it continuously into the birds' respiratory systems through the longest nights of the year. The moisture arithmetic is worth revisiting with the specificity it demands. Each adult chicken releases roughly 1 pint of water vapor daily through respiration and droppings combined. A flock of 40 birds in a sealed 12 by 12 foot coop is adding 40 pints, 5 gallons of moisture to that enclosed air volume every 24 hours. At outdoor temperatures below freezing, the warm, moist air produced by the birds rises until it contacts the cold ceiling and wall surfaces, where it condenses into liquid water that runs down the interior walls, saturates the upper litter layers, and drips from the ceiling onto the birds roosting below. The birds become wet. Wet feathers lose their insulating value almost entirely because the air pockets trapped within the feather structure that provide thermal resistance are displaced by water, and a wet chicken in a cold coop loses body heat to its environment at a rate that its metabolism cannot sustain. The sealed coop that was supposed to protect the birds from cold has made them more vulnerable to cold than they would have been in a well-ventilated structure with lower interior humidity. The ammonia dimension compounds this simultaneously. As moisture saturation increases in the lower litter layers, the aerobic decomposition that generates useful heat and suppresses pathogens shifts toward the anaerobic process that produces ammonia. That ammonia rises from the floor and mixes into the coop air, where it attacks the mucous membranes lining the bird's respiratory tracts with the same chemical aggression in a sealed coop as in an open one, but at concentrations that build continuously rather than dissipating through ventilation openings. A sealed coop on a cold January night is not a warm refuge. It is a slow accumulation of respiratory damage delivered to every bird in the flock simultaneously, with the effects appearing not as sudden crisis, but as the gradual immune suppression, reduced laying, and increased disease susceptibility that farmers often attribute to winter itself, rather than to the management choices that created the conditions. The Amish solution to this problem reflects the same counterintuitive clarity that characterizes their best farming practices, and it can be stated simply enough to fit on a single line: ventilate without drafting. The distinction between ventilation and draft is the entire skill of winter coop air management, and it is a distinction that beginning chicken keepers consistently fail to make. A draft is cold air moving across the birds' bodies at a velocity sufficient to strip the warm air layer trapped within their feathers, causing rapid heat loss in the same way that wind chill causes rapid heat loss in a human being standing outside without a coat. Ventilation is the controlled movement of air through the coop at a rate sufficient to remove moisture and ammonia without creating localized air currents fast enough to constitute a draft at bird level. The passive ventilation system that achieves this balance in a well-designed Amish coop exploits a phenomenon called the stack effect, which describes the natural tendency of warm air to rise and exit through openings near the top of an enclosed space, while cooler replacement air enters through openings near the bottom. In a coop designed for passive ventilation, narrow horizontal vent openings are positioned near the roofline on the north and east walls, oriented so that they allow air exchange without creating a direct line of airflow across the roost bars where the birds sleep. These high vents allow the moisture-laden warm air produced by the flock to escape continuously through the top of the building, driven upward by the same buoyancy that makes warm air rise everywhere else, while fresh outdoor air enters slowly through lower openings sized and positioned to distribute incoming air broadly, rather than channeling it as a concentrated cold stream. The sizing of these vent openings is where the skill of the experienced builder is most apparent, and where the difference between a coop that ventilates adequately and one that drafts destructively is measured in inches rather than feet. A total vent area of approximately 1 square foot per 10 birds is a guideline that experienced Amish coop builders use as a starting point, adjusted upward in climates with high humidity and downward in exceptionally cold and dry climates where moisture accumulation is less aggressive. These openings are typically fitted with adjustable covers that allow the farmer to increase or decrease the ventilation rate in response to observed conditions inside the coop, opening them wider during wet, mild weather when moisture production is highest, and partially closing them during the driest and coldest periods when the humidity balance requires less active management. The morning smell test that experienced farm wives apply at the co-op door is the practical instrument for evaluating whether the ventilation balance is correctly set, and it is more sensitive than any instrument the farmer would need to purchase. Air that smells of nothing beyond the natural organic scent of birds, bedding, and composting litter is air that is being exchanged at the right rate. Air that carries a sharp ammonia edge before the door is fully open indicates that the vents need to be opened further, regardless of how cold the outdoor temperature is, because the ammonia concentration developing inside the coop is already doing more damage to the birds' respiratory systems than the additional cold air entering through wider vents would cause to their thermoregulation. This is the counterintuitive truth that the viral potential analysis identified as the most shareable insight in this entire subject. A colder but well-ventilated coop is safer than a warmer but sealed one, and getting that backwards is the single most common and most costly mistake in winter chicken keeping. Everything the Amish build into their coop design, from its orientation on the landscape to the placement of its walls and windows, is constructed to make getting that balance right as automatic as possible. Walk the property with an Amish farmer before a new co-op is built, and you will not see a tape measure come out for a long time. The first instrument used is the body itself, specifically the face turned into the prevailing wind to find its direction, the eyes reading the slope of the ground for drainage, and the shadow cast by the farmer's own silhouette at midday in December to locate the winter sun's position in the southern sky. These observations, made across multiple visits to the site at different times of day and in different weather conditions, determine the co-op's orientation, elevation, and relationship to the landscape features surrounding it before a single post hole is dug or a single board is purchased. The siting decision is the most consequential design choice the farmer makes, because it determines how well every passive system inside the building will perform for the next 100 years, and it cannot be corrected cheaply after construction is complete. South-facing orientation is the foundational siting principle, and its logic derives directly from the passive solar physics described in the heat wall section. In the northern hemisphere, the winter sun tracks its lowest arc across the southern sky, never rising high enough to clear the horizon in the north, east, or west during the shortest days of December and January. A co-op with its primary glazed wall and heat mass surface facing south receives direct solar radiation for the maximum possible duration on every clear winter day, charging the thermal mass that will release its stored heat through the overnight hours. The same south-facing wall that receives maximum winter solar gain receives minimum summer solar gain because the summer sun tracks a much higher arc across the sky, and its rays strike the south-facing wall at an oblique angle that reduces the intensity of solar heating, providing natural seasonal temperature regulation without any mechanical intervention. The windbreak is the second major siting consideration, and its importance to winter cup performance is difficult to overstate in exposed agricultural landscapes where wind chill can drive the effective temperature far below the thermometer reading. Evergreen trees, planted or preserved on the north and northwest sides of the coop property, the directions from which the most severe winter winds arrive across most of the American Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states, create a zone of reduced wind velocity that extends downwind for a distance roughly 10 times the height of the trees. A mature row of eastern white pines or Norway spruces 40 feet tall creates a protected zone extending 400 feet downwind, within which wind speeds are reduced by 50 to 70% compared to the open field beyond the windbreak. The agricultural shelter belt program promoted across the American plains following the 1930s Dust Bowl demonstrated these wind reduction figures at landscape scale, establishing the evergreen windbreak as one of the most cost-effective farm infrastructure investments available in cold, exposed climates. Wind matters to a chicken coop for the same reason it matters to a human being standing outside in winter clothing. Moving air strips the insulating boundary layer from every surface it contacts. Outside the coop, wind drives cold air against the walls and roof at velocities that dramatically accelerate conductive heat loss through the building envelope, overwhelming the insulating value of straw and wool at sustained high wind speeds. Inside the coop, wind pressure differentials across the building cause air infiltration through every gap and crack in the envelope at rates far higher than calm conditions produce, introducing cold air directly into the interior space faster than the passive ventilation system was designed to manage. A co-op in a sheltered location behind an established windbreak loses heat to the outdoor environment at a fundamentally lower rate than the same coop in an exposed location. And that difference in heat loss translates directly into lower heating demand from every active and passive system inside the building. The elevation and drainage of the coop site address a set of problems that become visible only in the shoulder seasons, the wet periods of late autumn and early spring, when the primary threat to coop health shifts from cold to moisture infiltration from below. A co-op built on low ground or in a depression that collects surface water during rain or snowmelt will have a consistently wet perimeter, saturating the straw bales used for perimeter insulation, wicking moisture into the floor platform through capillary action, and creating the humid ground-level conditions that accelerate ammonia production in the lower litter layers during exactly the transitional periods when the litter system is most vulnerable to tipping from aerobic to anaerobic chemistry. Siting the coop on a gentle slope or on elevated ground with good natural drainage eliminates this moisture source entirely, a benefit that compounds through every winter the coop operates. The relationship between the co-op and the farmhouse deserves specific attention as a siting variable that purely agricultural analysis tends to overlook. An Amish coop is never sited so far from the farmhouse that the daily management routine, the heated stone carry, the morning feeding, the egg collection, the ventilation check, becomes a significant journey in bad weather. Winter storms in Pennsylvania and Ohio can produce conditions in which a walk of 200 yards through drifting snow represents a genuine physical challenge and a fall hazard for an elderly farmer or a young child carrying a hot stone in a burlap sling. The coop is positioned close enough to the farmhouse that daily management remains practical under the worst conditions the local climate produces, which in turn means that the passive systems inside the coop receive the consistent daily human attention they require to function at their designed performance level, rather than being checked less frequently because the conditions make checking them difficult. Snow accumulation on and around the coop is the final siting and design variable that distinguishes experienced Amish builders from beginning coop constructors, and it operates as both a hazard and an asset depending on how the building is designed to manage it. A steep roof pitch, typically 9 and 12 or steeper in heavy snow regions, sheds accumulating snow before its weight can stress the roof structure, while simultaneously ensuring that falling snow from the roof does not block the coop's door, pop door, or south-facing vent openings that are essential to daily management. At the same time, snow that accumulates against the north and west walls of a well-sited coop, drifting naturally in the wind shadow created by the building itself, adds an insulating layer to those walls whose thermal resistance is genuine and measurable. An experienced Amish farmer reads the drift patterns around the coop after each snowfall the way a physician reads a set of vital signs, learning from the pattern of accumulation where the wind is finding the building and where additional windbreak planting or structural modification might reduce the thermal load in future winters. Somewhere on the floor of almost every well-managed Amish chicken coop in Lancaster County, mixed into the surface layer of the deep litter at a concentration invisible to casual inspection, is a substance that looks exactly like ordinary white dust, and is anything but ordinary in its origins or its effects. Diatomaceous earth, called simply the good dust by farm wives in some communities who have used it for so long that its formal name has become unnecessary, is a soft, fine-grained sedimentary material composed entirely of the fossilized silica shells of diatoms, microscopic single-celled algae that lived in ancient freshwater lakes and marine environments across the planet for hundreds of millions of years. When those diatoms died, their intricate silica skeletons settled to the lake and sea floors in layers that compressed over geological time into deposits now mined in locations across the American West, including large operations near Lompoc in California and in the Clark County area of Nevada. The structure of an individual diatom shell, visible only under significant magnification, is a marvel of natural engineering. Each species produces a shell of a specific geometric design: cylindrical, elliptical, or radially symmetrical, perforated with a regular pattern of pores whose arrangement is characteristic enough that paleontologists use diatom species composition to date geological sediments with considerable precision. It is this structural complexity, this enormous surface area packed into a microscopic volume, that gives diatomaceous earth its two primary practical properties in a winter coop context. The first is moisture absorption. Diatomaceous earth absorbs liquid water and water vapor at a rate that exceeds most mineral materials of comparable particle size, drawing moisture from the litter surface and from the air immediately above it into the pore structure of the diatom shells, where it is held without being released back into the cup environment under normal temperature and humidity conditions. The second property is mechanical pest control, and it is the one that most surprises people encountering diatomaceous earth for the first time, because the mechanism involved is entirely physical rather than chemical. The sharp silica edges of the diatom shells, edges sharp enough to be felt as a slight abrasive quality when the material is rubbed between the fingers, lacerate the waxy outer cuticle of soft-bodied invertebrates that move through the dust. For a mite, a louse, or a small beetle larva, this laceration is catastrophic. The cuticle is the organism's primary water retention barrier, and once breached, the insect or mite desiccates and dies within hours to days, depending on the ambient humidity. Diatomaceous earth does not poison these organisms. It kills them through dehydration, which means that pest populations cannot develop resistance to it through the genetic mechanisms that allow them to develop resistance to chemical pesticides over successive generations. A mite population exposed to diatomaceous earth for 100 generations is no better protected against it than the first generation, because the mechanism of injury is mechanical rather than biochemical. In a winter coop, where reduced ventilation and increased bird density create conditions favorable for mite and louse population explosions, this persistent, resistance-proof pest control is worth considerably more than its modest cost suggests. Northern fowl mites, the species most prevalent in cold-climate coops across Pennsylvania and Ohio, remain active through winter temperatures that eliminate many other external parasites, feeding on blood from the bird's skin and causing irritation, feather damage, and anemia in heavily infested flocks. A bird, fighting a significant mite infestation, is allocating immune resources and metabolic energy to managing that burden rather than to thermoregulation and egg production, compounding the thermal and nutritional stresses of winter in exactly the way that the whole Amish management system is designed to prevent. Broadcast diatomaceous earth in the litter, at the dust-bathing areas, and along the base of the walls where mites travel between the floor and the wall surface, provides continuous passive protection against this specific winter threat at a cost of a few dollars per winter for a 40-bird flock. The dust-bathing behavior of chickens interacts with the diatomaceous earth application in a way that distributes the material through the flock's plumage more effectively than any direct application method could achieve. When a hen excavates a dust bath in a litter surface that contains diatomaceous earth at a few % of total composition, she throws the mixed material through her feathers and against her skin with the same vigorous wing action used in a normal dust bath, driving fine particles of the silicite material into the microhabitats between feather shafts and against the skin surface where mites and lice establish their feeding sites. The hen performing what looks like a recreational behavior is simultaneously self-medicating against external parasites, distributing a protective mineral dust through exactly the physical spaces where protection is needed, without any human action required beyond ensuring that the material is present in the litter at adequate concentration. One caveat belongs here, stated plainly because its omission from descriptions of diatomaceous earth use is a genuine disservice to the farmers who rely on this material. Diatomaceous earth in its fine powder form is a respiratory irritant for both chickens and humans when airborne at concentrations above a certain threshold, And the same sharp silica edges that damage mite cuticles can irritate the delicate tissues of the respiratory tract if inhaled in quantity. The appropriate use involves broadcast application directly onto the litter surface when birds are not present or are at the far end of the coop, followed by light incorporation into the surface layer with a rake or pitchfork rather than vigorous mixing that raises clouds of airborne dust. Only food-grade diatomaceous earth, which has not been heat-treated or chemically modified for pool filtration purposes, should be used around livestock. Pool filter-grade diatomaceous earth has been processed into a form whose silica particle structure is more hazardous to respiratory tissue than the unprocessed food-grade material, and the two products are not interchangeable despite their similar appearance and common source material. The presence of diatomaceous earth in the Amish Coop Management Toolkit illustrates a principle that runs through every practice in this story. The most effective tools are often the ones whose working mechanism is entirely natural, whose cost is negligible relative to their protective value, and whose application requires knowledge rather than equipment. A farmer who understands why the good dust works, what it is made of, what it does to the organisms it contacts, and how to apply it without creating the hazard it is meant to prevent, is a farmer who will use it correctly through every winter without needing to be reminded, retrained, or sold a replacement product. That understanding, passed through the community the same way every other piece of this system is passed, is the real product that the Amish farming tradition manufactures and distributes across generations, and the co-op that holds it all together performs best when its final variable, the number of birds inside it, is calibrated with the same care as every structural element surrounding them. The arithmetic of body heat in a chicken coop is more straightforward than most of the biology in this story, and it leads to a conclusion that beginning farmers consistently get backwards. A single adult laying hen maintains a core body temperature of roughly 107 degrees Fahrenheit and radiates excess heat into her surroundings continuously, in the same way that any warm object in a cooler environment loses heat to that environment through radiation, convection, and conduction. At rest, on a winter night, each bird produces somewhere between 8 and 10 watts of thermal energy as a byproduct of its resting metabolism, a figure modest enough when considered for a single bird, but significant when multiplied across a flock of sufficient size in an insulated space. 40 birds each producing 10 watts of body heat are collectively generating 400 watts of continuous thermal output, the equivalent of 4 old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs burning through the night, without consuming a watt of purchased electricity or a stick of purchased fuel. Whether that 400 watts of biological heat production actually raises the interior temperature of the coop to a useful degree depends entirely on how well the building envelope retains it, which is why the insulation and siting principles described in earlier sections of this story are prerequisite to the stocking density calculation, rather than separate from it. A poorly insulated coop loses heat to the outdoor environment faster than 40 birds can produce it, regardless of how closely they are packed together. A well-insulated coop with the thermal mass, deep litter, and windbreak protection described in this system can be brought to a survivable interior temperature by the body heat of a modest flock alone, with the other passive heating elements providing supplemental warmth that reduces the metabolic burden on each individual bird. The flock is simultaneously the primary occupant of the coop and one of its heating systems, and managing it as both requires thinking about stocking density and thermal as well as agricultural terms. The standard guidance on minimum floor space for laying hens, 4 square feet per bird in a closed winter coop, represents the lower boundary of a range that balances two competing requirements. Below 4 square feet per bird, crowding stress increases aggression, feather pecking, and disease transmission rates in ways that offset the thermal benefits of additional body heat per cubic foot of air. Above roughly 8 to 10 square feet per bird in a cold climate, the flock's collective body heat is distributed across too large a volume of air to produce meaningful temperature elevation, and the birds are effectively heating the coop less efficiently than a smaller number of birds in a proportionally smaller space would achieve. The 4 square feet figure is not arbitrary. It represents the density at which the flock produces enough collective warmth to contribute meaningfully to the co-op's thermal budget, while remaining spread out enough that social stress and disease transmission stay within manageable limits. Experienced Amish farmers in the coldest settlements of Lancaster and Holmes counties in Ohio apply a practical version of this thermal stocking calculation that does not involve square footage measurements or watt calculations, but produces the same result through a different instrument. After closing the coop on the first genuinely cold night of the season, typically in late October or early November, the farmer returns an hour after the birds have settled on the roost and opens the door a few inches, holding a bare hand just inside the opening. If the air flowing out across the hand feels noticeably warmer than the outdoor air, the flock's body heat is successfully elevating the interior temperature, and the stocking density is adequate. If the outflowing air feels indistinguishable from the outdoor air, either the flock is too small for the coop volume, the insulation is inadequate, or both, and an adjustment is needed before the first hard freeze arrives. This hand-at-the-door test is one of dozens of embodied diagnostic practices scattered through the Amish winter management system, each one a sensory shortcut to the same information that a thermometer, hygrometer, or ammonia meter would provide to a farmer willing to purchase and learn to use those instruments. The Amish preference for sensory diagnosis over instrument measurement is not anti-intellectual. It is the product of a community that has learned through experience that instruments require batteries, calibration, replacement, and a supply chain, while a trained hand or nose requires none of these things and degrades only with age rather than with neglect. The farmer who can read a coop's thermal state through the feel of the air at the door, the sound of the birds on the roost, the smell of the litter in the morning, and the weight of the eggs in the collection basket is carrying an integrated diagnostic system that no single instrument replicates. The relationship between stocking density and winter productivity extends beyond simple heat generation into the social and behavioral ecology of the flock in ways that connect back to the roosting dynamics described in an earlier section. A flock of the right density for its coop volume is a flock in which the birds can express their natural social behaviors, forming stable hierarchies, establishing consistent roosting positions, and maintaining the dust bathing and foraging activity that keeps the deep litter in its productive aerobic state, without the overcrowding stress that suppresses immune function and triggers the feather pecking and cannibalism that can devastate a confined winter flock within days. Density is not simply a space calculation. It is a social ecology calculation, and the 4 square feet guideline is the point at which the thermal math and the behavioral biology converge on the same answer. Composite accounts from farming families in Lancaster County and Holmes County describe the seasonal ritual of assessing and adjusting flock size before winter as one of the most consequential management decisions of the agricultural year, carried out with a seriousness that reflects its downstream consequences for every other system in this story. A flock too small for its coop enters winter with insufficient collective body heat and forces the stone heating and heat wall systems to carry a thermal burden they were designed to supplement rather than to shoulder alone. A flock too large for its coop generates ammonia and moisture faster than the ventilation system can manage, and creates the social crowding stress that unravels the behavioral equilibrium the entire winter management strategy depends upon. The right number of birds in the right size of coop, oriented correctly on the landscape, insulated properly against wind and cold, ventilated precisely enough to remove moisture without drafting, heated passively by stone and sun in the composting floor beneath their feet, and managed daily by people who have learned to read what every surface and smell inside the building is telling them, is not a system that any single element of this story fully captures on its own. It is a system that has carried tropical birds through northern winters for more than 3 centuries without a single watt of purchased power, and every element of it, from the river stone warming by the kitchen fire in the dark before dawn, to the fossilized algae dust scattered across the litter floor. From the south-facing wall, drinking in the low January sun, to the counter-current circulation in 40 pairs of chicken feet pressed flat against wide wooden bars in the warmest air the coop contains, exists because someone, in some winter long before living memory, noticed what worked and told the person standing next to them. That is how durable knowledge travels. Not through papers or patents or product launches, but through the specific gravity of one person showing another person something true. in a cold building before the sun comes up, when what works is the only thing that matters. Set every element of this story side by side, and what emerges is not a collection of separate techniques but a single integrated argument about what it means to solve a hard problem well. The Amish winter chicken system does not have a central mechanism that the other elements support. It has no keystone piece whose removal causes the whole structure to collapse. Every component, the south-facing heat wall drinking in January sunlight, the river stones warming beside the kitchen fire, the composting floor exhaling its microbial warmth upward through 8 inches of active biology, the flat-sided roost bars carrying 40 birds through the coldest hours in the warmest air the coop contains, the carefully sized vents bleeding moisture out without drafting cold in, functions as both a primary system and a backup for every other system surrounding it. This is the engineering principle called redundancy, and the Amish arrived at it not through systems theory but through the accumulated evidence of 300 winters selecting for what survives when one element fails. The red jungle fowl that became the domestic chicken was never designed for frost. Its single upright comb, its bare wattles, its relatively thin facial feathering, every anatomical feature that makes a chicken look like a chicken, evolved for heat dissipation in the steaming forests of Southeast Asia, where Gallus gallus had lived for millions of years before the first human being thought to confine it. The domestication event that pulled this tropical bird out of the jungle and set it on a path toward a Pennsylvania winter began, according to the best current evidence from researchers including Joris Peters and colleagues, around 1500 BCE in mainland Southeast Asia, probably in the context of rice cultivation rather than for food. The chicken reached northern Europe through Persia and Rome, spread across the continent on the backs of legions whose officers consulted its feeding behavior before battle, and arrived in Pennsylvania with the first German and Swiss settlers in the early 1700s, 3,000 years after it left the jungle and still carrying a body plan that evolution built for warmth. The community that received that bird and committed to keeping it alive through northeastern American winters, without the grid that the rest of the farming world would eventually rely on, built their solution from the materials the land provided and the physics the land obeyed. Stone from the creek bed, wood from the lot on the north boundary, straw from the grain harvest, wool from the sheep in the barn, the fossil algae compressed into white dust in the ancient lake beds of the American West. The south-facing slope that the farmer's grandfather chose when he sited the co-op in 1890-something, the knowledge of how to read a litter floor by feel and a coop's air by smell, carried from grandmother to granddaughter through the specific proximity of daily shared work. None of these materials are exotic. None of them require a catalog, a supplier, or a delivery truck. What they require is the knowledge of how to use them, and that knowledge is the actual product that 300 years of Amish winter farming has manufactured and preserved. What's more, the scientific framework that explains why this system works was being developed in university laboratories and agricultural experiment stations throughout the 20th century, in complete independence from the communities that had been practicing the principles for generations. The Ohio Agricultural Experiment Station researchers who documented the heat-generating and pathogen-suppressing properties of deep litter in the 1940s were not aware that they were confirming practices already old in Lancaster County. The passive solar architects who formalized the Trombe Wall in 1967 were not referencing Amish fieldstone construction. The avian physiologists who mapped the rate mirabile countercurrent heat exchange in bird legs were not thinking about flat roost bars in Pennsylvania chicken coops. The science and the practice arrived at the same conclusions by entirely different routes, which is the strongest possible evidence that the conclusions are correct. When independent lines of inquiry converge on the same answer, that convergence is not coincidence. It is the shape of something true. The ventilation paradox that sits at the center of this system deserves one final emphasis, because it is the principle most likely to save a flock and the one most consistently violated by beginning farmers following their instincts. A sealed, warm coop is more dangerous to a winter flock than a ventilated, cool one, because dampness and ammonia kill chickens faster and more certainly than cold, dry air does. Healthy, well-feathered adult chickens tolerate temperatures well below freezing without significant physiological stress, Provided their feathers are dry, their air is clean, and their feed ration is adequate for the thermoregulatory demand the temperature imposes. The real winter killers are not the thermometer's reading but the moisture that seals Coops' trap, the ammonia that moisture-driven anaerobic decomposition produces, and the frostbite that large-combed breeds suffer when poorly chosen breed meets poorly designed coop in a climate that neither was built for. Remove those three killers through ventilation, breed selection, and co-op design, and the cold itself becomes a manageable variable rather than an existential threat. The broader lesson that this system offers to anyone keeping animals, growing food, or maintaining any living system through conditions it was not originally designed to survive is not specifically about chickens or stones or straw. It is about the difference between a solution that addresses the symptom and a solution that addresses the system. A heat lamp addresses the symptom. It makes the air inside the coop warmer, which is the immediate measurable problem, while doing nothing about moisture management, ventilation balance, breed selection, roost design, litter biology, or the thermal performance of the building envelope. When the lamp fails, everything it was compensating for is still present, unaddressed, and the flock is in worse condition than it would have been under a system that built resilience into every layer rather than concentrating all the thermal work into a single electrical device. The Amish system addresses the system. Each element reinforces the others, and the failure of any single element is absorbed by the redundancy built into the whole. Brother Wilfrid Chatelain, the Cistercian monk in Quebec who spent a decade breeding the Chanticleer in the early 1900s, and the unnamed Lancaster County farm wife, who first pressed her hand into the deep litter on a January morning to feel the warmth of microbial activity rising through the bedding toward her fingers, and Thorleif Skjelderup Ebbe, watching chickens in a Norwegian yard in 1921 and seeing in their dominance hierarchy a pattern that would eventually describe every social organization from a corporate board to a military unit, and Felix Strombe, calculating the heat storage capacity of a south-facing stone wall in 1967, were all working on the same problem from different angles. The problem is how to keep living things alive and productive through conditions that conspire against them. The answer, in every case, is the same. Understand the system deeply enough that your solution works with its physics rather than against them. Build redundancy into every layer so that no single point of failure is catastrophic. And pass what you learn to the person standing next to you before the knowledge disappears with you into the cold. The chicken in the snowy yard is still a jungle bird. It will always be a jungle bird. But in the right coop, built from the right materials, oriented toward the right sky, managed by hands that know what they are touching and why, it will lay an egg tomorrow morning nonetheless.